Hello, story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. Let me take you back a few years to a time when my life revolved around late-night shifts. It was a quiet, solitary world that I thought I knew well. My name is Kevin, and I worked as a data analyst for a mid-sized financial firm. The office was located on the 13th floor of a high-rise building downtown, a floor often referred to as the forgotten floor by those who worked there. Why forgotten? Maybe it was because the management rarely visited, or because our floor didn't have the glamorous views other parts of the building offered. Either way, we were left to our own devices. My schedule was different from most. While my colleagues worked during the day, I had volunteered for the night shifts. I had my reasons. It was quieter, free of the usual office chatter, and allowed me to focus. The office, with its soft hum of computers and the faint glow of emergency exit signs, became my second home. I wasn't completely alone in the building. The cleaning staff usually came through around 10 p.m., though they never stayed long. The security guard, a middle-aged man named Miguel, made his rounds every few hours. We exchanged pleasantries whenever our paths crossed. "All quiet?" I'd ask. "Always," he'd reply with a tired smile. On a typical night, I would arrive at the office around 8 p.m. The city streets were already starting to empty, the rush hour chaos giving way to a serene stillness. Parking was never an issue at that hour. I'd grab a coffee from the convenience store downstairs and ride the elevator up to the 13th floor. The elevator ride always felt longer than it should, the outdated system groaning as it climbed higher. Once inside the office, I'd settle into my corner desk. It was an open-plan office, but the spaces felt personal with dividers and personal touches, photographs, mugs, and even some potted plants people left behind when they quit. My desk was bare save for my laptop, a desk lamp, and a notebook where I jotted down thoughts. The air conditioner had a way of humming louder at night, and the office's fluorescent lights cast long shadows that somehow felt more alive after sunset. The work itself wasn't thrilling. I'd comb through spreadsheets, create reports, and send emails that wouldn't be read until morning. The monotony was broken by small rituals: a trip to the pantry to refill my coffee, a quick glance at the window to see the city lights, or the occasional message from a friend asking if I was still awake. The pantry, by the way, was a lifeline. Stocked with instant noodles, coffee pods, and vending machines, it had everything a late-night worker needed. I often found myself standing there, staring out of the small window that overlooked the neighboring buildings. The reflection of my own tired face would often startle me proof of how isolated I felt. Apart from Miguel, there was Jamie from IT, who sometimes stayed late to run server updates. He was younger than me, always plugged into his headphones, nodding to music only he could hear. We didn't talk much beyond a casual hey, but it was reassuring to know I wasn't always the only one around. Then there was Claire from the HR department. She often left handwritten notes for me on my desk about files she needed or questions she had about reports. Claire was meticulous, one of those people who paid attention to detail. I'd leave her replies on sticky notes she'd collect in the morning. We never actually met face to face during those shifts, but it was almost like having a pen pal. The building itself had its quirks. The air vents sometimes whistled when the wind hit them just right. The motion sensor lights in the hallways would flicker for no reason, and there was that one spot near the elevator where the floor always seemed colder. Nothing unusual, really. Just little things you notice when you're alone long enough. That was my life back then, a routine as predictable as the ticking of a clock. Night after night, I walked into that office, worked through the silence, and walked out just as the morning crew arrived. It felt safe, normal, unremarkable. But normalcy has a way of lulling you into a false sense of security. It's only when something disrupts that rhythm that you realize how much you've taken it for granted. That disruption came in the form of something I can't quite explain, at least not yet. The first strange event happened on a Wednesday night, a night like any other. I remember it vividly because of how utterly ordinary it began. My shift had started smoothly. I was working on a quarterly financial report, typing away at my keyboard, and taking periodic sips of lukewarm coffee. The office was its usual quiet self, with the faint hum of the air conditioner filling the space. Miguel had made his first round about an hour ago, giving me his customary all quiet before disappearing down the hallway. I assumed he'd moved on to the lower floors, as he usually did. The cleaning crew had already come and gone, leaving behind the faint scent of disinfectant. I was alone, as always, with only the glow of my monitor and the occasional creak of the building to keep me company. It started small. I was typing an email when I heard the unmistakable sound of keys jangling. At first, I thought nothing of it. Miguel often carried a ring of keys that clinked together as he walked. But this time, the sound didn't fade as it usually did when he moved away. Instead, it lingered, as though someone was standing just outside the door to the main office area. I paused, listening. The jangling stopped. "Miguel?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence. There was no answer. I leaned back in my chair, straining to hear. The building had its fair share of Quirk's pipes groaning, air vents whistling, and the occasional bang from the elevator shaft. But this sound had been distinct. It wasn't mechanical. It was human. After a moment of silence, I shrugged it off. Maybe Miguel had dropped his keys or was checking something nearby. I went back to my report, chalking it up to a random occurrence. About an hour later, I got up to stretch my legs. My usual routine was to take a walk down the hallway, past the meeting rooms, and to the pantry for another cup of coffee. The motion sensor lights flickered on as I entered the hallway, but something was different this time. One of the lights near the end of the corridor began to flicker erratically. I stopped mid-step, watching as the light struggled to stay on. It wasn't unusual for the building's lights to act up. This wasn't exactly a state-of-the-art office. But there was something unsettling about the way this particular light behaved. It wasn't the typical on-off flicker. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate, like a strobe. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. Faulty wiring, I muttered to myself. As I continued down the hallway, the light stopped flickering. But just as I passed beneath it, I swear I felt a shift in the air, a coldness that wasn't there moments before. It wasn't the type of chill you get from an overactive air conditioner. It was something deeper, something that seemed to seep into my bones. I quickened my pace, the sound of my shoes echoing louder than usual in the empty space. By the time I reached the pantry, I was shaking it off again, convincing myself it was just my imagination. Still, I couldn't help glancing over my shoulder as I poured my coffee. On my way back to my desk, I passed by one of the larger meeting rooms. The door was ajar, which was odd because the cleaning crew always locked them after tidying up. I paused, peering inside. The room was dark, but I could make out the faint outlines of chairs around the large conference table. I hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "Miguel?" I called out again, my voice softer this time. No response. Reaching out, I pushed the door open. The hinges creaked, and the sound seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness of the office. I flicked on the light switch, but nothing happened. The room remained dark. The logical part of my brain told me it was just a burned-out bulb. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around, my eyes darting to the corners of the room. Nothing. Just an empty conference room. I backed out, pulling the door shut behind me. I told myself I'd report the malfunctioning light to maintenance in the morning. For now, I just wanted to get back to my desk and the familiarity of my screen. By the time I sat down again, I was feeling increasingly uneasy. The rational side of me kept trying to explain everything away: the jangling keys, the flickering light, the cold air, and the locked room. But there was a small, nagging voice in the back of my head telling me something was off. I opened a chat window on my computer and messaged Jamie. He was online, probably running one of his overnight updates. "Hey," I typed. "You ever notice anything weird on the 13th floor at night?" It took a minute before he replied. "Weird how?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid. "Like noises or lights acting strange." Jamie's reply came quickly. "Old building, man. Stuff like that happens. I don't pay attention to it." "Why? You hearing things?" "Yeah, I guess. Nothing serious," I wrote back, though I wasn't convinced. "Get some headphones," he replied, followed by a laughing emoji. "Drowns out all the weirdness." I closed the chat window and tried to focus on my work. Jamie's nonchalant response helped, but only a little. There was still a tension in the air, a feeling I couldn't shake no matter how much I tried. As the night wore on, I started to feel like I was being watched. Every time I glanced at the glass partitions separating the desks, I half expected to see someone standing there. Of course, there was no one. But that didn't stop my mind from playing tricks on me. Just as I was beginning to settle down again, I heard it, the jangling keys. This time, they were closer, much closer. The sound was coming from the hallway just outside the main office area. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. My eyes darted to the door, which was partially open. The sound stopped abruptly, as though whoever or whatever had been making it knew I was listening. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. "Miguel?" I called out for the third time that night. My voice was steadier than I felt. No response. I stepped toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I debated whether to step into the hallway or stay where I was. In the end, curiosity or stupidity won out. I pushed the door open and stepped into the corridor. The hallway was empty. The flickering light at the far end had stopped its erratic dance, and everything was eerily still. The only sound was the faint buzz of the overhead lights. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing with each step. Reaching the spot where the sound seemed to have come from, I stopped and looked around. There was nothing out of place, no jangling keys, no Miguel, nothing. But as I turned to head back to my desk, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the floor, right where I had heard the noise, was a single key. It gleamed under the harsh fluorescent light, looking as though it had been deliberately placed there. The sight of the lone key on the hallway floor jolted me more than I cared to admit. It wasn't just its presence, it was the way it seemed to gleam under the light, as though it were inviting me to pick it up. My rational mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe Miguel had dropped it while making his rounds, or one of the cleaning crew had left it behind. But why here, in the middle of the hallway, in the dead of night? The office was too quiet, too still. I bent down to pick up the key, the sound of my breathing unnaturally loud in the emptiness. It was an ordinary-looking key, silver, with no tag or distinguishing marks. As I held it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow significant, though I had no idea why. With the key now in my pocket, I walked back to my desk, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Every creak of the floor, every shift in the air seemed amplified. The office felt different, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I tried to refocus on my work, but my concentration was shot. The glow of the monitor seemed harsher, the shadows cast by the desk lamps longer. I was hyper-aware of every sound, the hum of the air conditioning, the distant click of the elevator, and the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights. Then I heard it again, the jangling keys. This time, they were accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps. They weren't the casual, purposeful strides of Miguel or anyone else I knew. These steps were slow, deliberate, almost hesitant. I stood up, heart pounding, and peered toward the hallway. The sound stopped. "Hello?" My voice wavered, but I forced the word out. "Nothing." I took a few cautious steps toward the hallway, my palms slick with sweat. The corridor stretched out before me, empty and bathed in the sterile glow of the overhead lights. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The unsettling occurrences began to stack up. The motion sensor lights, which normally worked flawlessly, started flickering erratically, plunging sections of the office into temporary darkness. The temperature seemed to drop inexplicably, the cold seeping through my shirt and making my breath visible in the dim light. At one point, my computer monitor glitched. Static filled the screen for a few seconds before it went black. When it came back on, the email draft I'd been working on was gone, replaced by a blank page. My heart sank, but before I could think too much about it, something else grabbed my attention. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow darted across the glass partition near the meeting rooms. It was quick, almost too quick to register, but it was there. I turned my head sharply, scanning the area, but saw nothing. "Get it together," I muttered to myself, rubbing my temples. But the sense of unease was growing. Every instinct I had was screaming that something wasn't right. Unable to focus, I pulled the key from my pocket and examined it under the desk lamp. It was plain, unremarkable, and yet it felt heavier than it should. I tried to think of where it might belong. The locked meeting room from earlier came to mind. Taking the key, I walked back to the room. The hallway seemed longer now, the distance stretching unnaturally. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the keyhole, the cold metal of the key biting into my fingers. Finally, I inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked open with a sound that echoed in the silence, far louder than it should have been. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was just as I'd left it, dark, empty, and unsettling. But now, it felt different. The air was heavier, charged with an almost electric tension. I reached for the light switch, flicking it on. The bulb sputtered to life, casting a dim, yellowish glow over the room. The shadows seemed deeper here, clinging to the corners and the underside of the table. On the table, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a piece of paper, folded neatly. It hadn't been there earlier, of that I was certain. My hands shook as I picked it up and unfolded it. Written in jagged, almost frantic handwriting were two words: "Leave now." The note sent a jolt of fear through me, but it also ignited a stubborn determination. I wasn't about to run off based on some cryptic message. I had to understand what was happening. I decided to check the security cameras. The building's surveillance system was accessible from the main desk on the ground floor, but I could also access it remotely from my workstation. I logged in and pulled up the feeds from the 13th floor. The footage was grainy, but it showed the empty hallway, the meeting rooms, and my own desk. I fast-forwarded through the recording, watching for anything unusual. And then I saw it. At 2:37 a.m., the camera facing the meeting room I had just unlocked captured movement. A shadow, tall and vaguely human-shaped, passed in front of the door. But it wasn't the shadow of anyone walking. It moved unnaturally, sliding across the floor without lifting or falling like normal steps. I rewound the footage, watching it again and again. My stomach churned. This wasn't something I could explain away. As I sat there, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, I noticed something else on the footage. At the exact moment the shadow appeared, the timestamp glitched. The numbers flickered erratically before resuming as if nothing had happened. I glanced around the office, half expecting the shadow to materialize behind me. The screensaver on my computer reflected the room back at me, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of movement in the reflection. I turned sharply, but the room was empty. My chair creaked under me as I sat back, my pulse racing. Later that night, as I tried to settle back into my work, I heard a low, rasping sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second. It sounded like breathing. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The sound wasn't coming from the hallway or the nearby rooms. It was close. Too close. I spun around in my chair, searching for the source. The office was empty, as far as I could see. But the breathing persisted, steady and unnatural, as though something unseen was standing right beside me. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping it around the room. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the desks and partitions. But there was nothing there. When the sound finally stopped, it left behind an oppressive silence that was almost worse. By 3 a.m., I was on edge. The shadows seemed to press in closer, the air thicker with every breath I took. My nerves were frayed, and every small sound made me jump. My resolve to stay and figure out what was happening was crumbling, but something deep inside kept me rooted in place. I had to see this through, whatever this was. The raspy breathing hadn't returned, but the silence that replaced it was far from comforting. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, like it was watching me, waiting for something. I decided to return to the meeting room, the one with the ominous note. Somehow I felt drawn there, like it held the answers I was searching for. My legs felt like lead as I walked down the hallway, every step echoing like a gunshot. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The key was still in my pocket, its cold weight a reminder of how this all started. Slowly, I pushed the door open. The room was dark, but not empty. In the faint light spilling in from the hallway, I could make out a figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Its body was shadow-like, but not insubstantial. It had form, edges that seemed to ripple and shift as though it was made of living darkness. Its face, or where a face should have been, was void, a blackness so deep it seemed to pull the light toward it. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. The figure didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, oppressive and overwhelming, like a physical weight pressing down on me. The logical part of my mind screamed at me to run, to get as far away as possible. But my body wouldn't cooperate. My legs refused to move, my voice stuck in my throat. All I could do was stand there, staring at the impossible thing before me. Then it moved. It didn't walk or glide, it just shifted, as though the space around it folded and bent to its will. One moment it was by the table, the next it was closer, its form looming over me. The temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The sheer wrongness of the thing made my stomach churn, and I felt an almost primal fear, a terror that bypassed reason and struck at something deep and ancient within me. The figure raised what might have been an arm, its shadowy limb stretching unnaturally toward me. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound deafening in the oppressive silence. And then it spoke. The voice was a low, guttural whisper that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my mind. "You should not be here." The word sent a jolt of terror through me, and finally my body responded. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I scrambled to get away. My back hit the door frame, and I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers slick with sweat. When the lights flickered on, the figure was gone. But the sense of its presence lingered, heavy and suffocating. The room was exactly as it had been before, empty, silent, and unremarkable. Yet I knew what I had seen was real. I ran back to my desk, my heart racing. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But when I unlocked the screen, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The wallpaper, which had always been a picture of my dog, was now black. In the center of the screen was a single word, written in the same jagged handwriting as the note: "Stay." My phone slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor. The sound seemed to snap me out of my paralysis, and I bolted for the elevator. The corridor stretched out before me, the fluorescent lights flickering ominously as I ran. The elevator doors opened with a ding, and I slammed the button for the ground floor repeatedly, my eyes darting around the hallway. As the doors slid shut, I caught one last glimpse of the shadowy figure standing at the far end of the hall, its featureless face turned toward me. The elevator descended, but it felt agonizingly slow. I pressed myself against the wall, clutching the railing for support. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. When the elevator doors finally opened, I stepped out into the lobby, the familiar surroundings doing little to calm my nerves. I rushed to the security desk, hoping to find Miguel or someone else who could help. But the desk was empty. The monitor displaying the building's security feeds was still on, showing the various floors and hallways. I scanned the screens, my eyes locking onto the feed for the 13th floor. There it was. The shadowy figure stood in the middle of the hallway, motionless. As I watched, it turned slowly, as if it knew I was watching. And then, the screen went black. The monitor powered down with a faint hum, leaving me alone in the dimly lit lobby. My breath came in shallow gasps as I backed away from the desk, my mind screaming at me to leave. But as I turned toward the exit, I noticed something that made my heart stop. The key. It was sitting on the reception counter, gleaming under the lobby lights. My instinct screamed at me to get out of the building. Whatever this thing was, this presence, it wasn't human, and it wasn't bound by the laws of the world I understood. It had spoken to me, moved in ways that defied reality, and left me teetering on the edge of complete panic. I grabbed the key from the counter without thinking. Its cold weight in my hand sent a chill through me, as though it still carried the essence of that room on the 13th floor. My mind warred with itself. One part wanted to drop it, to leave it behind as I ran into the night, while another part whispered that I might need it, that it was somehow tied to what was happening. The lobby was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural. My footsteps echoed as I crossed to the exit, each step filled with mounting urgency. I pushed against the glass doors, half expecting them to resist, but they swung open with a soft creak. The cool night air hit me like a wave, a sharp contrast to the oppressive atmosphere inside. My heart raced as I stumbled out onto the sidewalk, the city lights and distant hum of traffic grounding me in reality. I was out, but the sense of relief was short-lived. As I stood there, catching my breath, I glanced back at the building. It loomed over me, its glass facade reflecting the streetlights like a dark, silent sentinel. From the outside, it looked normal, ordinary, even. But then I saw it. In one of the top floor windows, a faint movement caught my eye. I squinted, my heart pounding as I tried to make out what it was. There, silhouetted against the dim glow of the interior lights, was the shadowy figure. It wasn't standing still this time. It was moving, slowly but deliberately, as if pacing the room. Then it stopped, and for a moment, I thought it was looking directly at me. I turned away, my pulse thundering in my ears. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that whatever this thing was, it had marked me in some way. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I found a late-night diner a few blocks away and settled into a corner booth, ordering coffee after coffee as I tried to make sense of what had happened. My mind replayed the events over and over, the strange noises, the note, the shadowy figure. Every detail seemed significant, yet none of it added up. What was that thing? Why had it appeared to me? And what did it mean by, "You should not be here"? I wanted to believe it was all in my head, a trick of exhaustion and an overactive imagination. But the memory of its voice, that guttural whisper resonating in my mind, was too vivid to dismiss. When dawn finally broke, painting the city in soft hues of orange and pink, I felt a momentary sense of peace. The daylight seemed to push back the fear, making the events of the night feel like a distant nightmare. But as I left the diner and started walking, I realized something was wrong. Everywhere I went, I felt like I was being watched. It wasn't overt, no shadowy figures in the street or mysterious sounds following me, but the sensation was undeniable. A prickling at the back of my neck, a fleeting movement in my peripheral vision, a subtle shift in the air around me. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was paranoia, a natural response to the trauma of the night. But as the days went on, it became harder to dismiss. One evening, as I sat in my apartment trying to unwind, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from an unknown number. The message was short, 13th floor. My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. I hadn't told anyone about the events at the office. I hadn't even mentioned the 13th floor to my closest friends. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a picture, It was a grainy image of the key, the one I had taken from the meeting room. It was sitting on my desk, exactly where I had left it. I turned around, my heart hammering in my chest. The key was still there, untouched. The messages stopped after that, but the sense of unease remained. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed some boundary, stumbled into a reality I wasn't meant to see. I considered going back to the building, confronting whatever was there. But the memory of that shadowy figure, of its voice, kept me away. Instead, I quit my job. I couldn't bring myself to step foot in that office again, let alone work there. My manager was surprised, but didn't press for details. In the weeks that followed, I tried to move on. I found a new job in a different part of the city and threw myself into the routine of daily life. But the experience left a mark. Sometimes, late at night, I would wake up to the feeling of being watched. I would sit up in bed, heart racing, and scan the room, half expecting to see that shadowy figure standing in the corner. It never was, but the fear lingered, a constant companion, a reminder that some doors are better left unopened. Months have passed since that night, yet the experience has stayed with me, carving a space in my mind that refuses to fade. I left the job, the building, and even the part of town where it all happened, but the memory follows me like a shadow. There are nights when sleep eludes me, and I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail in my head. I think about the key, the figure in the window, the voice that spoke to me. I've tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation, but the truth is, there isn't one. It's not something I talk about openly. When friends ask why I left my old job, I shrug it off with a vague excuse about stress or needing a change. How could I possibly explain what happened without sounding crazy? Even I struggle to believe it some days. This happened to me a few years ago, and it's a night I can never forget, no matter how hard I try. I was just a regular guy, living in a bustling city, trying to make ends meet while juggling work and the usual grind of life. At the time, I had a decent job that required frequent travel across the region, mostly by train. The train system was reliable and convenient. I had taken the same route countless times without a second thought. That night, though, something changed. It was a typical evening as I made my way toward the platform, my mind already preoccupied with the events of the day. It was late, much later than usual, and I had just missed my earlier train. I couldn't afford to miss the next one, so I rushed through the station, my steps echoing on the cold tiled floors. The fluorescent lights above flickered as I passed, casting odd shadows on the walls. The station was quieter than usual. Most of the commuters had already gone home, leaving behind a strange emptiness that I couldn't shake off. I wasn't the only one waiting for the train. There were a few other passengers standing at various spots along the platform, but the atmosphere felt different. There was a sense of unease, something I couldn't quite pinpoint. Maybe it was the lateness of the hour, or maybe I was just overthinking things, but I couldn't help but feel like something wasn't quite right. As the train approached, I felt a sense of relief. I had just enough time to hop on before the doors closed. The moment I stepped inside, I immediately noticed how eerily quiet it was. There were only a handful of people scattered throughout the car. A few commuters sat by themselves, staring out of the windows, lost in thought, while others kept their eyes fixed on their phones. The hum of the train's wheels against the tracks was the only sound, and it seemed louder than usual, almost as if it was trying to drown out everything else. I took a seat by the window, hoping to relax during the short ride home. I settled in, leaned back, and glanced around. The train car was like any other I had ridden on before, dimly lit, with the faint smell of old upholstery mixed with the faint scent of something unfamiliar. But that was the least of my concerns. What caught my attention was the man who had just stepped into the car. He wasn't sitting far from me, his eyes scanning the empty seats as if searching for someone. The strange thing was, he didn't seem to care that there was an empty seat right next to me. He just stood there, staring, his eyes never once leaving my face. I did my best to ignore him, chalking it up to coincidence. But as the train began to move, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The man's gaze was unsettling, and the longer he stared, the more I began to feel like a target. Something was off, but I couldn't quite figure out what it was. I kept telling myself that I was just being paranoid, that it was nothing more than my tired mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The train continued to rumble along the tracks, and the city lights outside blurred past, casting brief flashes of light into the car. I tried to focus on the passing scenery, but my attention kept drifting back to the man. I couldn't help but notice how still he was, how he didn't move a muscle despite the train's movement. It was as if he was frozen in time, waiting for something. At that moment, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was coming, and I couldn't escape it. The strange feeling that had been creeping up on me all evening was now undeniable. The train, the quietness, the man, it all felt wrong. And then something happened. A flicker, a brief flash of light. The man's eyes shifted ever so slightly, and I could have sworn I saw something in them that made my stomach drop. A glimmer of something sinister, something unexplainable. I couldn't look away. That was the first unsettling incident, the first moment that set everything in motion. What I didn't know then was that this was just the beginning of something far worse, something I couldn't have prepared for, no matter how hard I tried. The train continued its monotonous journey, the rhythmic clatter of its wheels against the tracks offering a strange comfort. I tried to focus on the passing city lights outside, but my mind kept drifting back to the unsettling feeling that had settled in my chest. There was something off about the man who was sitting near me. At first, it was the way he stared without blinking, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made the air feel thick with tension. But it was more than that. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. The lights inside the train flickered again, this time longer, casting strange shadows across the car. It wasn't unusual for older trains to have occasional electrical issues, but the flickering seemed deliberate, almost as if it were trying to signal something. My eyes darted to the windows, half expecting to see something, anything, out of the ordinary. But the city outside looked normal: dark streets, the occasional passing car, a few flickering streetlights. It was late, but it was nothing that would normally cause concern. I glanced back at the man. He hadn't moved, still staring in my direction, though his expression had changed slightly. Where there had been an almost casual indifference, there was now something cold. His lips were pressed together in a thin line, and his shoulders were tense, rigid. It was as though he was waiting for something, though I couldn't figure out what. My heart began to race, and I could feel the hairs on my neck rise. My gut told me to get off the train, to run, to do anything but sit there and wait for whatever this was to unfold. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed there, frozen in place, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. It was late. I was tired. I had a long day behind me, and the exhaustion was clouding my judgment. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild. But even as I thought it, I knew that wasn't the case. The man, the strange flickering lights, the oppressive silence, they all meant something, something I wasn't prepared to face. A few minutes passed in tense silence. I tried to distract myself, reaching into my bag to pull out my phone, but even that felt futile. The screen lit up in front of me, but I couldn't focus on anything. The phone felt foreign in my hands, like a piece of technology that no longer served its purpose. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything in the car had taken on a sense of heaviness, as though the very air was growing thicker with each passing second. And then, just when I thought I could calm down, it happened. The train lurched, a violent jolt that threw me off balance. My heart skipped a beat as I grabbed the armrest to steady myself. It was the kind of bump you'd expect when the train changes tracks, but this felt different. The movement was jerky, almost like the train had been forced off course. The lights flickered once more, this time plunging the car into darkness for a split second before returning to their dim, unreliable glow. I looked up from my seat, my heart pounding in my chest. The man hadn't moved an inch. His gaze was still fixed on me, but now there was something more. A glint of something dark in his eyes, something that didn't belong in the quiet stillness of the train. His lips curled upward slightly in what I could only describe as a grin, a smile that seemed out of place, almost unnatural. A chill ran down my spine as the temperature in the car seemed to drop, the air growing colder, thicker. I could hear the faint sound of something scraping against the metal of the train. It was a subtle noise, at first barely noticeable, but as the seconds dragged on, it grew louder, more pronounced. It was like a scratching, like something was trying to claw its way into the car from the outside. I looked out the window, half expecting to see something there, but there was nothing. Just the darkened city street stretching out beyond the glass. But the sound persisted. It was then that I realized I wasn't the only one who had noticed. A woman seated across the aisle from me, who had been silently reading a book, looked up with a start. Her eyes darted around the train car, her body stiffening. She was clearly nervous, just as I was, and I could see her grip tightening on the book in her hands. But what struck me the most was the look in her eyes. She was scared. Not just uneasy, but genuinely terrified. It wasn't the kind of fear you get when you're in an unfamiliar place. It was something deeper, something primal. The man, however, didn't seem fazed by the unsettling noise. He remained still, his eyes still locked on mine. His grin had grown slightly wider, but it was no longer a smile that could be mistaken for something friendly. It was the kind of grin you'd see on a predator before it pounced on its prey. I felt a bead of cold sweat form on my forehead as I instinctively glanced around the car. I was trapped. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The train slowed down suddenly, and for a moment, the noise stopped. The car was deathly silent again, but the tension in the air was suffocating. I couldn't breathe. It was as though every sound in the world had been swallowed up by the heavy silence that surrounded us. The woman across from me stood up abruptly, her book falling to the floor with a soft thud. She rushed toward the door, her eyes wide with panic. She didn't even look back. I could hear her muttering to herself, but her words were barely audible over the pounding of my heart. She reached for the door, and I could see her hand trembling as she tried to twist the handle. But it didn't open. She tried again, this time pulling at the door with all her strength, but it was no use. The door wouldn't budge. "Let me out," she screamed, her voice a mix of fear and desperation. Her fingers were turning white as she clawed at the handle, but the door remained firmly shut. The man remained still, watching her. I wanted to say something, anything, to help her, but the words wouldn't come. The fear that had gripped me before had now taken root in my chest, a cold, unshakable terror that left me paralyzed. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was watch as the woman's face contorted in sheer panic, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Finally, with a final, desperate pull, she stumbled back from the door, her face pale and drenched in sweat. She fell into the seat across from me, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her wide, fearful eyes met mine for a brief moment, and I saw the truth in them, the same truth that I had been trying to deny. The tension in the train car continued to build, thickening the air with a sense of impending doom. The flickering lights had returned, this time accompanied by a faint hum that vibrated through the floorboards beneath my feet. It wasn't the steady hum you'd hear from an old piece of machinery. No, this was different. It had an unsettling quality to it, as though something was trying to push its way into our world, something that didn't belong. I could feel it in my bones, a creeping sense of dread that had settled deep within me, pushing away all rational thought. I wanted to look away from the man sitting across from me, but my eyes kept being drawn back to him, like he was some kind of magnet. His expression hadn't changed. He still wore that unnervingly calm grin, the same cold look in his eyes. But now there was something else, something more sinister. His hands were folded neatly on his lap, his fingers twitching ever so slightly, like he was waiting for something to happen. Waiting for it to be time. The woman who had tried to open the door, the one who had fled to the seat across from me, was still sitting there, her face pale and drawn with fear. She was clutching her purse tightly, as though the simple act of holding something could anchor her to reality. Her eyes darted around the car, wide and fearful, as if she were expecting something or someone to appear from the shadows at any moment. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, she closed her eyes tightly, as if trying to shut out whatever was happening around us. I couldn't blame her. The whole train car felt wrong, as though the very fabric of reality had begun to tear at the seams. The flickering lights were now growing more erratic, flashing on and off in quick bursts, like the train was being subjected to some unseen force. The metallic clank of the train's wheels against the tracks seemed distant, muffled, as if something was interfering with the usual rhythm. It was as if the train was no longer running on its own accord, as if it had become part of something far darker and more dangerous. I stood up abruptly, my legs unsteady beneath me as the train lurched once again. I couldn't sit there any longer, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching us, that we weren't alone in the car. I needed to do something, anything, to break free of the suffocating silence that had taken hold of the place. I moved towards the front of the car, where the conductor's cabin was located. Maybe there was someone there, someone who could explain what was happening. I needed to find out what was wrong with the train, why it felt like it was being pulled into some sort of abyss. But as I passed the other seats, I noticed something strange. The people who had been sitting there moments before were gone, vanished. The train had become eerily quiet, the only sounds now being the soft hum of the flickering lights and the occasional rattle of the train's frame. I froze in place. I had to be imagining things. There were passengers here just a few minutes ago. I couldn't have been mistaken. I turned slowly, scanning the empty rows of seats, half expecting to see anyone emerge from the shadows. But there was nothing. Not a single soul. Just an empty, abandoned train car. The woman who had been sitting across from me was now gone as well, her seat abandoned, the purse she'd been clutching still sitting on the armrest. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I backed away from the empty seats, suddenly aware of how quiet the car had become. There were no footsteps, no rustling of clothing, no murmurs of conversation. It was as though I had been transported to a place where time had stopped, where all the normal rules of reality no longer applied. The train lurched again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the usual bump or jolt as we passed over a track switch. This was something heavier, something more violent. The car shuddered violently, and I heard a sharp, guttural screeching noise from somewhere deep within the bowels of the train. It was the kind of sound that made my stomach churn, a horrible grinding sound that seemed to reverberate through my bones. I ran back to my seat, nearly tripping over my own feet in the process. I couldn't stay in the aisle. I couldn't leave the safety of my seat, not with whatever this thing was moving through the train. The lights flickered again, the brief flashes of light revealing strange shapes in the corners of the car. I could see shadows moving, flickering at the edges of my vision, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. I sat down, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow. Sweat was beginning to form on my forehead as the reality of the situation began to settle in. I wasn't imagining things. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain. I had to get off this train. But the thought of getting up and walking toward the door made my stomach churn. The door wouldn't open before. What if it wouldn't open now either? I looked at the man across the aisle, still sitting motionless in his seat, staring straight ahead. He hadn't moved an inch. But now, there was a subtle shift in the air around him, a tension that hadn't been there before. The faintest trace of something dark lingered in the air, something malevolent. It seemed to pulse around him, like a living, breathing thing. The grip on my seat tightened, my knuckles white with fear. I could feel it, the presence that had been watching us for so long, now closing in. Whatever was happening, whatever had started, it was only getting worse. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get off the train. I jumped up from my seat again, this time determined to reach the door. But as I stepped into the aisle, I heard a noise, a soft, shuffling sound from behind me. It was a slow, deliberate noise, like someone or something was dragging itself across the floor. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, and there, standing in the doorway between the cars, was a figure. A tall, thin silhouette, shrouded in darkness. The figure didn't move, just stood there, blocking the way. I couldn't see its face, but the sense of pure dread that washed over me told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't human. Not anymore. The train lurched again, and this time, the lights went out completely. Darkness enveloped the car, the oppressive blackness swallowing everything in its wake. My heart raced, my senses heightened, as I stood frozen, unable to move or speak. I couldn't see the figure anymore, but I could hear it. Its breathing, slow and deliberate, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The temperature in the car dropped, a bitter, icy chill that numbed my skin. I was no longer sure what was real anymore. The train had become a twisted nightmare, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead had blurred. My mind was spinning, my heart was pounding, and I could feel the cold, clammy sweat dripping down my back. The oppressive silence was broken only by the faint sound of footsteps moving closer, and the breath of someone who was no longer human. I knew, without a doubt, that I was trapped. The stillness of the train car was suffocating. The darkness pressed down on me like a physical force, so dense and absolute that I felt as though I were drowning in it. Every nerve in my body screamed for release, to run, to escape, but my legs were paralyzed, as if rooted to the cold metal floor beneath me. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, each exhale visible in the frigid air. The figure in the doorway had not moved, but I could feel it watching me. Its presence was overwhelming, like a shadow that stretched across my very soul. My eyes strained in the darkness, trying to make sense of the silhouette before me, but it was impossible. It was as if the darkness itself refused to allow me to see anything clearly. Suddenly, the train lurched once more, jerking violently as if it were being pulled off the tracks. The lights flickered again, but this time, instead of just dimming, they shattered completely. The world went pitch black, save for the faint outline of the figure. It was closer now, so close that I could feel its breath, cold and heavy, sinking into my skin, seeping into my bones. I could hear its footsteps now, soft and deliberate, like the echo of death itself. I wanted to scream, to shout, to ask for help, but my voice was trapped. It was as though something had stolen it from me, leaving only a hollow, oppressive silence that amplified the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. The figure stepped forward, and I caught the faintest glimpse of its face in the dim light. It was twisted, deformed, and its eyes black as coal bore into mine with an intensity that chilled me to my very core. The grin it wore was too wide, too unnatural, and I could see the glint of sharp teeth behind its thin lips. It wasn't human anymore. Whatever it was, it had long since shed its humanity. I stumbled back, my legs finally finding the strength to move. But no matter how fast I ran, the figure seemed to be getting closer. The sound of its steps grew louder, more urgent, and the air around me seemed to grow thicker, heavier, until it felt like I was swimming through liquid. The temperature dropped even further, an unbearable cold that sunk deep into my skin. I was freezing, but the fear that gripped my heart was even colder. With every step, the figure seemed to warp, its form shifting, changing, becoming something even more monstrous. The darkness around me pulsed, alive with an unseen force, and the air itself felt suffocating. I reached for the door, my hands shaking violently, but the handle wouldn't turn. It was as if the door had been sealed shut by some unseen force, trapping me inside with whatever this thing was. Then, in the midst of the chaos, the most horrifying sound shattered the silence, a laugh. Low, guttural, and impossibly deep, the laugh echoed through the train car like a death rattle, vibrating the very walls. It wasn't a laugh that belonged to any human. It was the sound of something ancient, something born of darkness, something that had been waiting for this moment. I turned to look at the man across the aisle, the one who had been sitting there so calmly earlier. He hadn't moved an inch, his eyes still fixed ahead. His smile had only grown wider, and now, as the creature neared, his face seemed to twist in pleasure. It was as if he was in on something terrible that I couldn't understand. I tried to speak, to ask him what was happening, but the words wouldn't come. My mouth was dry, my tongue thick with fear. The figure's grin stretched wider, and I realized with sudden, horrifying clarity that it wasn't just after me. It was after all of us. We had all been trapped here, drawn into this nightmare together. I wasn't the only one it wanted. The realization sent a jolt of pure panic through me, and I bolted toward the door once again, desperate to escape whatever this thing was. But it was too late. The figure was upon me in an instant, its icy fingers wrapping around my arm with a vice-like grip that sent a shock of pain through my body. I struggled, trying to pull away, but the creature's strength was inhuman. It pulled me toward it, and as it did, I felt something strange, a cold, numb sensation that spread from where its fingers touched my skin. It was like my very life was being drained, like it was stealing my essence, my soul. The world seemed to tilt around me, the walls of the train car bending and warping as if they were made of paper. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of something rotting. I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred as the creature's grip tightened, and I felt my body growing weaker by the second. I reached out in desperation, my hand brushing against the window as I fought to stay conscious. Through the fog of fear and panic, I saw something. A face. A face staring back at me from outside the train. It wasn't the face of a person, though. It was a face I had seen before on the woman who had vanished earlier. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. She was standing outside the train, pressed up against the glass, as though she were trapped on the other side. But I knew better. She was already gone. She had been taken, just like the others. And now, it was my turn. I could feel myself slipping, my body succumbing to whatever dark force the creature had unleashed. My mind was going foggy, my thoughts drifting away like leaves in the wind. But before I could lose myself completely, I heard a voice, a whisper that cut through the darkness. "You should never have gotten on this train," it said, the voice hollow and cold. "None of you should have been here." I tried to scream, but my voice was nothing more than a dry croak, lost in the noise of the train's twisted, otherworldly hum. I could feel the coldness spreading through my chest now, and with it, an overwhelming sense of finality. There was no escape, no hope. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, everything stopped. The train, the figure, the cold, everything vanished in an instant, leaving me standing alone in the dark, the echoes of the creature's laughter still ringing in my ears. The world around me was silent, still. I was free. But was I really? Was I ever free? Or had I just exchanged one nightmare for another? My legs gave out beneath me, and I sank to the floor of the train car, my breath still shaky, my heart pounding in my chest. It was over, I thought. But deep down, a gnawing feeling remained, an unsettling certainty that this wasn't truly the end. Whatever had happened on that train, whatever force had been unleashed, was still out there, waiting. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that it wasn't done with me yet. The cold train car felt like a tomb, a place where time had stopped, and I had been caught in the middle of something far beyond my comprehension. My body trembled uncontrollably as I sat there, the cold metal beneath me grounding me to the present, yet my mind was miles away. What had just happened? Was I dreaming? Was it a nightmare? I couldn't tell anymore. I managed to pull myself together, my breath still ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. The train, or whatever it had been, was eerily quiet now. The world outside was nothing but an endless blur of darkness, as though the train had been cast adrift in some other dimension, somewhere that didn't belong to reality. I rubbed my face, trying to clear my mind, but the images, the grotesque figure, the chilling laughter, the twisted faces of those trapped with me kept flashing in my mind. Every time I blinked, it felt like I could still see that thing looming in the shadows, waiting. But the train had stopped. The darkness that had consumed everything before had lifted, and in its place, there was nothing but an unnerving silence. I didn't know how long I'd been sitting there, lost in my own thoughts. Time seemed irrelevant. The train had no windows, no way to tell where I was, or even if I was still on the same train. My body felt as though it had been dragged through hell, every inch of it bruised, battered, and drained of energy. My mind screamed for answers, but I knew, deep down, that I wasn't going to find any. With shaky hands, I reached for the door once again, desperate to get out of the suffocating stillness. This time, the handle turned easily, and I stumbled out into the hallway, nearly tripping over my own feet. I couldn't hear anything, no sounds of train wheels against tracks, no ambient hums of machinery. Just silence, like the world had gone completely still. I walked cautiously, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of life, but there was no one. The train, the people who had been with me, were all gone. The man who had sat across from me earlier, the one who had been so calm, so unbothered by the strangeness unfolding around us, he was nowhere to be found. No sign of the woman in the white dress. No trace of the man who had disappeared earlier. I was alone. But was I truly alone? I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. In the distance, I saw something, a flicker of movement, a shadow darting between the train cars. My heart raced again, a primal fear flooding my veins as I took a cautious step forward. Was it the thing from before? The creature? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me, still haunted by the horrors I had witnessed? I forced myself to walk toward it, my mind at war with itself. I wanted to run, to get away, to forget everything, but some part of me knew I had to see this through. I had to understand what had happened, what was still happening. I reached the next train car, and the door was wide open, as if inviting me in. Hesitant, I stepped inside. The air inside was stale, heavy with a scent that I couldn't place. Something rotting, something wrong. I could barely make out anything in the dim light, the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. I called out, my voice weak and trembling, but there was no answer. Just the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. I moved further in, cautiously, my hands brushing against the cool walls, trying to steady myself. As I rounded a corner, I froze. There, in the corner of the car, was the woman. The one who had vanished earlier, the one I had seen through the window. She was standing in the corner, facing the wall, her back to me. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. Her head was tilted at an odd angle, her hair hanging loosely around her face, covering it like a veil. I took a step forward, my pulse quickening. The silence was suffocating, and I could hear the faintest sound of breathing, slow, labored, like she was struggling for air. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. The air around her seemed to shimmer, as though the very space around her was different from the rest of the train. Something wasn't right. I moved closer, my instincts screaming at me to turn around, to leave. But I couldn't. Something was pulling me toward her, some twisted curiosity that I couldn't shake. I reached out, my hand trembling, and just as my fingers brushed against her shoulder, she turned. Her face, it wasn't her face. At least, not the way I remembered it. It was pale, almost lifeless, the skin stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes were hollow, black pits of nothingness, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. Her lips parted, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, and a voice low and guttural whispered, "You shouldn't have stayed." I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. My breath caught in my throat as the air seemed to press in on me, suffocating me. The train car grew darker, colder, and I could feel that familiar, terrifying presence creeping back into the space. The creature, the thing that had been hunting us, wasn't gone. It was still here, still watching, still waiting. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to escape. I sprinted down the hallway, my feet pounding against the floor as I tried to get away from whatever this place had become. I passed empty car after empty car, each one just as lifeless and eerie as the last. My mind screamed for answers, but I knew deep down that there was no answer that could explain this madness. Eventually, I found the door again, the one that led outside. My hands shook violently as I fumbled with the handle, praying it would open, praying I would be free. The door swung open with a soft creak, and I stumbled out into the cold night air. The world outside was dark, but it wasn't the same darkness. The train had stopped at some point, and the tracks stretched endlessly before me. No sign of civilization, no sign of life. Just me, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. I looked back at the train, expecting to see it still there, but there was nothing. No train, no shadow, no sign of the nightmare I had just endured. Just empty space. It was as though it had never existed at all. And yet, I knew it had. I knew what I had experienced was real, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't truly over. Something had followed me out. Something was still with me. As I turned to walk away, I realized I wasn't alone. I could feel its presence, just behind me, like a shadow, just out of sight. The weight of it pressed on me, suffocating, all-encompassing. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Whatever that thing was, whatever it had done to me and the others on that train, it hadn't let me go. Not really. As I walked away from the wreckage of that night, the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly before me. The air felt colder with each step, a gnawing chill that sank deep into my bones. My mind raced, clinging to every shred of reality that had once anchored me, but the weight of what I just experienced had begun to erode it. Every turn, every shadow, felt like it could be the start of something worse, something that would follow me, haunt me, long after I had left that cursed train behind. I should have felt relief. The train, the horrifying figures, the suffocating silence, they were gone. But there was no sense of freedom, no clarity to ease my panic. The fear hadn't left me. In fact, it had taken root, deep within, and it was only growing stronger the further I went from that infernal place. I walked for what felt like hours, but I wasn't sure anymore. My sense of time was warped, like it had been stretched and twisted by the events that unfolded. The world around me seemed just a little too quiet, a little too still. Every rustle of wind, every distant sound made my heart leap into my throat. Was it just my mind? Or was something out there still stalking me? I tried to keep going, to push forward, but the thought of what had happened on that train kept dragging me back, like an anchor sinking me into the depths of dread. What had I seen? What had I been a part of? The faces, those hollow eyes, the figure that had loomed in the shadows, whispering promises of torment, were they real? Or had I imagined them, my mind playing tricks on me after hours of isolation? The answer to that question didn't matter anymore. I couldn't deny the truth that had become so painfully clear to me. The thing I had encountered on that train wasn't just a product of my fear, it was real. It had touched me, twisted my perception, and it had followed me out into the world. I felt it now, lurking in the corners of my vision, just behind me, like a shadow that never fully receded. At some point, I stumbled across a small road, a faint sign of civilization. The faint glow of streetlights, the distant hum of a car engine, the possibility of a life outside the nightmare. I wanted to run towards it, to seek help, to find someone who could explain what I had lived through. But something held me back. A part of me, the part that still clung to the hope that everything could be normal again, told me that it wasn't that simple. I reached for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, but when I checked the screen, I found nothing but a blank display. No signal. Nothing. The panic set in again, and I felt my throat tighten, my breath becoming shallow. I couldn't go back. I couldn't stay out here alone. And yet, there was no escape. Not from what had happened. Not from whatever had followed me. I didn't know how long I stood there, the phone slipping from my hand as I sank to my knees. The world was too quiet, too still. The weight of the silence was unbearable. Then I heard a sound, faint but unmistakable. A low, guttural laugh that chilled me to the core. I froze, my body locking up as my breath caught in my chest. That laugh, it was the same one I had heard on the train. The same twisted, sickening sound that had echoed through the dark halls of the train, reverberating in my skull like a curse. I couldn't see where it was coming from, but I knew it was close. Too close. I stood up shakily, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. My heart raced, my palms slick with sweat as I scanned my surroundings. There was nothing, just empty streets. But the laughter, that mocking, cruel sound, it wasn't just a memory. It was real, and it was hunting me again. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, just needing to escape. I couldn't outrun it though. I knew that. It was always with me. It had always been with me. The creature, the nightmare, whatever it was, it had never left. It had only waited for the moment to strike again. As I ran, I found myself in an unfamiliar part of the town, a place I had never been before. I had no idea how I got here, no idea where I was going, but the presence behind me pushed me forward. I stumbled past darkened windows, empty alleys, and quiet streets, the eerie laughs still echoing in my ears, growing louder with each step. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was an overwhelming presence, one that filled every corner of my mind and every inch of my body. I stopped in front of a small, dilapidated building. The door cracked open. It looked abandoned, but I didn't care. I just needed somewhere to hide, somewhere to escape. I pushed the door open, stumbling inside. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. It was a small, empty room, just like the train car. Nothing made sense anymore. The walls, the floor, everything felt wrong. The silence pressed down on me again, heavy and suffocating. I turned, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. Just emptiness. I sank to the floor, my hands gripping my head, trying to make sense of it all. But the truth was clear now. I would never escape this. I would never escape it. No matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to forget, the thing from the train would always be there, waiting, lurking in the shadows of my mind. It was the kind of day that, on the surface, seemed to promise nothing more than another routine adventure like many others that had come before it. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden way over the land. I had just wrapped up a long week at work, and a road trip was exactly what I needed to unwind. Something about the open road, the hum of the tires against the pavement, and the isolation of being far from the city always brought me a sense of peace. Little did I know, this trip would change everything. I set out alone, as I often did when I needed to clear my mind. The car I was driving had been with me for years, a reliable old thing that had weathered countless road trips. It had its quirks, of course. The leather seats creaked, and the engine had a tendency to sputter if I drove too fast for too long, but it was mine. I trusted it. The route I was taking was through the desert, a stretch of highway that ran through the most desolate areas. No towns, no gas stations, just endless stretches of sand, rock, and the occasional cactus. It was the kind of road that felt like it went on forever, yet somehow, in a strange way, it felt liberating. My mind wandered as the miles passed by, the scenery changing from rocky terrain to flat plains. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I preferred it. My thoughts were the only company I needed. The world outside felt so quiet, so still. The kind of silence that allowed you to listen to your thoughts clearly, without distractions. But soon enough, I would learn that silence can be deceiving. The quiet roads held more than just peace. They also harbored things that couldn't be easily explained. By the time I reached the halfway point of my journey, the sun was setting. The sky had turned to a deep, fiery orange, casting long shadows across the land. It was around this time I realized that I hadn't passed another vehicle in hours. The highway, usually bustling with traffic, was now completely empty. I couldn't even see the faintest sign of life on the horizon. It was as if the world itself had shut down, leaving me alone in the vast emptiness. This isolation should have felt comforting, but it didn't. There was something unsettling about the stillness of it all. The kind of eerie quiet you might experience when you're in the middle of nowhere, and suddenly you realize just how alone you are. I pushed the feeling to the back of my mind, deciding that it was just my overactive imagination. The night was falling quickly, and I had planned to stop at a small roadside diner I passed earlier. It was the only building I had seen for miles, and I figured it would be a good place to rest and grab some food before continuing on. But as I made my way back to the highway, I noticed something strange. There was a car parked near the diner. A dusty old sedan, its headlights dim but still glowing. It looked out of place, considering how far out in the desert we were. I slowed down as I approached, peering through the windshield to see if anyone was inside. The car looked abandoned, the windows rolled up tight, and no signs of movement. I parked my car nearby and stepped out. The air was thick with the smell of dust and the faint scent of something I couldn't quite place. My shoes crunched against the gravel as I made my way toward the diner, but my steps faltered as I noticed something peculiar. The lights inside the diner were flickering, as though the power was struggling to stay on. I felt an odd chill creep up my spine, but again, I brushed it off. The diner had probably been here for years, and maybe the electricity was just old. As I pushed open the door, the bell above it rang with an unsettling jangle, and I was greeted by silence. The diner was empty, not a soul in sight. At first, I thought it was just closed for the night, but something about the way the place looked in, with a sense of abandonment, gave me pause. The chairs were pushed out from the tables, as if people had been sitting there moments ago. A half-empty coffee cup sat on one of the counters, and the faintest sound of an old jukebox hummed in the background. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. Had I missed a sign saying it was closed? No, there was nothing indicating that the diner wasn't open. Yet, no one was here. The eerie stillness was broken only by the hum of the jukebox and the occasional creak of the building settling. I called out, my voice seeming to echo strangely in the empty room. "Hello? Is anyone here?" Nothing. Just the sound of the jukebox playing an old crackling tune that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was something unsettling about that song. It didn't fit the place, it didn't fit the moment. I took a few more steps inside, deciding I would wait a little while before leaving. Maybe I was just overthinking things. It wasn't the first time I'd found myself in an empty diner, and it wouldn't be the last. But as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt thick, heavy even, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Then, the jukebox abruptly stopped. That was when I heard it. A faint, distant sound, something that couldn't be explained. A soft scratching noise, followed by the faintest whisper of movement from somewhere behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing. No one. Just the empty diner and the quiet hum of the old fridge in the corner. I was alone, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, my eyes scanning the empty diner. The strange scratching sound had stopped, and the jukebox had gone silent. Everything was still, unnervingly so. I felt a wave of unease wash over me, but I tried to shake it off. My rational mind told me it was nothing more than the wind outside, or maybe an old air conditioning unit groaning to life. But deep down, I knew that the sense of foreboding wouldn't leave me so easily. I took a slow breath, trying to steady myself. I glanced at the old fridge in the corner, wondering if the noise had come from there. Maybe it was just the machinery, or perhaps it was a mouse scurrying around the old building. The thought gave me little comfort, but it made sense at least in my mind. I moved towards the counter, my shoes making soft clicking sounds against the tiled floor. The diner had an odd, antiquated charm, its outdated decor reminding me of a place from a movie set in the 1950s. The walls were lined with faded pictures of desert landscapes, and the counter was cluttered with dusty menus and salt shakers that looked like they hadn't been used in years. I reached out to grab the menu in front of me, hoping the mundane act would help me calm my nerves. As my fingers brushed against the paper, I heard it again, a soft scuffling sound. This time, it was definitely coming from the back of the diner, just beyond the swinging kitchen doors. I tensed up, my heart skipping a beat. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a worker in the back. But I hadn't seen anyone when I entered, and now that the sound had started again, I couldn't ignore it. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice more uncertain this time. It echoed off the walls, but there was no reply. The silence that followed felt thick, almost suffocating. I stepped carefully towards the kitchen, my breath shallow and uneven. My hand hovered over the swinging door, and I hesitated. What if it was just someone who hadn't heard me? Or maybe it was nothing at all. I didn't want to seem foolish for getting spooked over something so insignificant. But I couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach, urging me to turn back. Yet, some part of me pushed forward, driven by the nagging curiosity that made me question what was behind that door. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The kitchen was a mess. But more than that, it was dark. Not just dim or poorly lit, but unnaturally so. The overhead lights were out, casting everything in a sickly, yellowish glow. The counters were covered in grease stains, and old pots and pans were scattered haphazardly, their surfaces coated in a layer of dust. The fridge was ajar, its interior dark and empty. But there was something else, something far more unsettling than the mess. At the far end of the kitchen, near the back door that led to an alley, was a figure. I could barely make it out at first, but as I stepped closer, the dim light revealed a person hunched over, crouching with their back to me. Their movements were slow, deliberate, like someone who had been in the same position for hours or longer. I froze, unsure of what to do. The figure didn't notice me standing there, and there was a strange stillness to their actions. The only movement came from their hands, which were slowly dragging something across the floor. My mouth went dry, and my instincts screamed at me to leave, to run. But my legs wouldn't move. My mind was too busy processing what I was seeing. I wanted to call out, to ask if they needed help, but my throat tightened and no sound came out. The figure suddenly stopped moving. For a split second, it felt like time had frozen. Then, without warning, the figure turned around to face me. What I saw made my blood run cold. The person's face was pale, almost sickly, with dark circles under their eyes. Their clothes were tattered, and their skin was stretched tightly over their bones, as if they hadn't eaten in days. The eyes wide, unblinking, and far too large for their face, stared at me with an eerie intensity. The look on their face wasn't one of surprise or recognition, but something darker. A hollow emptiness that sent a chill through my entire body. Before I could react, the figure stood up and backed away toward the door, its movements jerky and unnatural. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. Was this some kind of prank? A drugged-out person playing a sick joke? But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I opened my mouth, about to call out, but the figure was already gone. The kitchen door swung shut with a force that rattled the entire room. The scraping sound returned, this time more frantic, as if something or someone was desperately trying to get away from me. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. My breath came in short, rapid bursts, and I felt lightheaded. I needed to leave. I didn't care about the food anymore, or whether the diner was even open. I just needed to get out. I quickly exited the kitchen and hurried to the front door, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my keys. My mind kept replaying the scene I had just witnessed. Was that person real? Had I imagined it? but I knew deep down that I hadn't. The fear I felt was all too real. As I stepped outside, I felt the cool desert air hit my face, but it didn't ease the tightness in my chest. The car, parked just outside, felt like my only escape. I rushed toward it, my legs moving faster than I ever thought they could. My hand trembled as I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat, locking the door behind me. For a moment, I sat there, breathing heavily, my eyes scanning the empty desert around me. I thought about calling the authorities or going back into the diner to confront the strange figure. But something told me it would only make things worse. The wind howled through the empty landscape, and I realized just how isolated I truly was. As I drove away from the diner, my mind was a whirlwind of confusion and dread. Was this some kind of hallucination? Was I losing my mind? I couldn't make sense of it, no matter how hard I tried. But as I glanced back in the rearview mirror, I could have sworn I saw something moving in the shadows behind the diner. Something or someone watching me leave. The air felt thick as I continued driving down that desolate highway, the headlights of my car cutting through the darkness. I had hoped the strange encounter at the diner would be nothing more than a bizarre fluke, a freak occurrence that I could easily brush off. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Something was wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. For the first few miles, the only sound in the car was the steady hum of the engine and the occasional rattle from the loose rearview mirror. But as I drove further into the emptiness of the desert, I started to notice something off about the night. The air outside had grown colder, and the moon was now barely visible through the cloud cover. The wind, once a gentle breeze, now carried a sharp chill that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. There was nothing behind me, no headlights, no signs of another car. But the unease didn't subside. In fact, it only seemed to grow. My fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. It wasn't just the physical isolation, it was something else, something darker, that I couldn't quite place. The thought of going back to the diner crossed my mind. I wasn't sure why, but I felt a compulsion to return. What if there was an explanation for what I had seen? Maybe there was someone else who could shed light on the strange figure in the kitchen. Maybe I was just overthinking it. But a nagging voice inside me warned that the answers I sought could only lead to more danger. I made a split-second decision to turn around. My tires kicked up dust as I swung the car in a sharp U-turn, heading back toward the diner. The drive felt longer this time. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the dark, barren landscape around me looked more oppressive with each passing mile. Every shadow seemed to conceal something lurking just out of sight, and I felt a growing sense of dread. As I approached the diner, I noticed the lights were still on, but they flickered intermittently. The faint buzz of the neon sign outside made my skin crawl. I parked in the same spot I had before, but this time I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching underfoot. The cold night air wrapped around me, and I pulled my jacket tighter against my body. The diner looked even more decrepit up close, as if it had been abandoned for years, despite the lights still being on inside. I hesitated for a moment, my pulse quickening, before I made my way to the door. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, but this time there was no warm greeting from a waitress, no friendly chatter in the background. The diner felt more oppressive, like the walls were closing in on me. The sense of abandonment hung heavy in the air, and the silence was almost suffocating. I moved slowly through the diner, my eyes scanning the tables, the booth seats, but there was no sign of the strange figure. I called out into the stillness, but there was no reply. It was as though the place had been frozen in time. Everything was just still. That was when I heard it again. The same soft, scraping noise from before, coming from the back of the diner. This time, however, it was louder, more frantic. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I slowly approached the source of the sound. Each step felt like it echoed through the silence, amplifying the unease in my chest. When I reached the kitchen door, I stopped. The air felt heavier here, as if the atmosphere itself was thick with tension. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see the dim glow of the kitchen lights from within. I couldn't just stand here forever, but the thought of what I might find inside terrified me. Pushing the door open, I stepped into the kitchen again. It looked the same as before, a mess of forgotten dishes and old, abandoned cookware. But this time, the kitchen felt colder, and the silence was far more oppressive. The fridge door was open again, and the faint sound of something scraping against the floor echoed through the room. There, standing in the far corner of the kitchen, was the figure again. This time, it was different. The figure wasn't crouching. It was standing tall, unnaturally so, as if its body didn't quite fit the proportions of a human. Its back was arched, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, those wide, hollow eyes, were fixed on me. I froze. For a moment, neither of us moved. It seemed like time had stopped, the room around us sinking into an eerie stillness. My breath caught in my throat, and my legs felt like they were cemented to the floor. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around and run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure in front of me. Then, with a sudden jerky movement, the figure took a step forward. Its feet dragged across the floor in a disjointed motion, like someone who hadn't walked in years. The sound was sickening, like a scraping noise that echoed through the small space. I took a shaky step back, my heart pounding in my chest. What was this thing? Was it human? The rational part of my mind told me it had to be, but nothing about this figure made sense. It wasn't right. In a panic, I spun around and bolted for the door. My mind was a blur of fear as I scrambled to get out of there, not daring to look behind me. I heard the scrape of footsteps following me, growing louder, closer. It was as though the figure was chasing me, its movements growing more erratic with every passing second. I stumbled out of the diner and into the cold night air. My heart raced as I fumbled for my car keys, but as I turned to unlock the door, something stopped me. A shadow moved across the diner window, something large, something unnatural. My blood ran cold. The figure wasn't just inside the diner, it was outside now, too. I didn't wait for any further confirmation. I jumped into my car, started the engine, and slammed the gas pedal down to the floor. The tires screeched as I sped away, the dim lights of the diner growing smaller in my rearview mirror. But the feeling of being followed didn't go away. Even though I was driving as fast as I could, the sense of dread was ever present. The darkness of the desert stretched out before me, and with each passing mile, I felt more and more disconnected from the world I had known just hours before. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing in the middle of the road, watching me. But nothing was there. At least, not yet. The car's tires hummed against the endless stretch of asphalt, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. My hands gripped the wheels so tightly my knuckles had gone pale. Every corner I turned, every shadow I passed, seemed to blur together in a nightmarish haze. The fear that had been gnawing at me all evening was no longer something I could ignore. It had become a living, breathing thing, clawing at my insides. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone on that road. No matter how fast I drove, it felt like someone, or something, was right behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I kept checking the rearview mirror, but every time, there was nothing there. The road was empty, the night still and quiet, but the sensation of being watched never left. And then, just as I thought I might start to lose my mind from the fear, it happened. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of movement, just a brief, unsettling shadow passing by my peripheral vision. My stomach dropped, and I slammed on the brakes, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. I looked up at the road ahead, expecting to see something, anything, that could explain the sensation of something being there. But there was nothing. No car, no person, no lights. The road ahead stretched into an abyss of darkness, the only illumination coming from my headlights. I felt the sweat begin to bead on my forehead, and for a split second, I considered stopping entirely, pulling over, and trying to regain my composure. But something deep inside me screamed that I couldn't. If I stopped, if I stayed still for even a moment, whatever it was that had been following me would catch up. With my breath coming in ragged gasps, I pressed my foot back on the accelerator, pushing the car forward even faster. The tires screeched as I tried to get away from whatever was lurking in the dark. But the faster I went, the more the air seemed to thicken, as though the road itself was closing in on me. Every twist and turn felt like a trap, like the road was drawing me deeper into something I couldn't escape from. And then, a sound sharp and unmistakable cut through the silence of the night. A loud bang. I jerked the wheel in response, my heart racing as I swerved to the right, narrowly avoiding a patch of rocks that had suddenly appeared in my path. My hands trembled as I fought to regain control of the car. The sound had come from the back of the vehicle. Something had struck the car, hard enough to make the whole vehicle shake. I glanced in the rearview mirror once more, and that's when I saw it. A figure! It wasn't just standing by the road. It was moving quickly, impossibly fast, like it was gliding across the asphalt. The figure's shape was distorted, a tall, grotesque silhouette that seemed to stretch unnaturally as it moved. The face, it was all wrong. It didn't have eyes, not real ones. Instead, there were dark, hollow pits, gaping open like black voids, staring right at me through the mirror. I nearly choked on my breath, the terror coursing through me in waves. This wasn't a person. It couldn't be. The figure wasn't human, and I was certain that whatever it wasn't just some random, twisted hallucination. This thing had been following me all along. I couldn't think. I couldn't process what I was seeing. My body acted on pure instinct. I slammed my foot down on the gas, the engine roaring as I pushed the car to its absolute limit. The speedometer climbed, but even as I tried to outrun it, I could feel the presence of the figure gaining on me. The road stretched on endlessly, but it felt like it was closing in around me. The headlights now seemed to cast long, distorted shadows on the pavement ahead, the darkness pressing in on all sides. The figure in the rearview mirror never left. It was gaining ground. Every glance I took, I saw it there, its form more defined now, more horrific, its limbs long and bent at impossible angles. It was moving with unnatural speed, its head twisting to keep locked on my every movement. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain shoot up my spine as though someone had jabbed an icy needle directly into my body. I gasped, my vision blurring for just a second, and when I looked back up, the figure was right there in the middle of the road, directly in front of my car. My foot slammed down on the brake, but it was too late. I hit it. Or, at least, I thought I did. The car's front end collided with something solid, the crunch of metal and the screeching of tires filling the air. But when I looked over the hood of the car, there was nothing there. The road was empty, as if nothing had ever been in front of me. Confusion and fear overtook me. I looked out my window, searching desperately for any sign of the thing. But again, nothing. There was only the empty stretch of road. I took a few shaky breaths, my pulse still racing in my ears. I tried to steady my hands as I reached for the door handle, intending to get out and see what had happened. But the moment I unbuckled my seatbelt, I froze. From the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the distance. Just at the edge of my vision, I saw a shadow shift, stretching unnaturally tall, moving at a pace I couldn't comprehend. My heart skipped a beat. I turned slowly, and there, right beside my car, was the figure. It was too close. The sight of it nearly made my chest collapse in on itself. It was standing next to the driver's side window now, its long, gangly fingers tapping against the glass in slow, deliberate motions. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from those black, empty sockets. And then it spoke. The voice was wrong. It was nothing like a human voice. It sounded more like a series of distorted, garbled whispers, 1,000 different voices layered on top of each other. They were saying something, but I couldn't make it out. The words were incoherent, broken, twisted into something incomprehensible. I froze, the terror settling deep in my bones, and I realized that I was no longer in control of the situation. The thing outside the car wasn't just toying with me, it was playing a game, one that I wasn't sure I could win. For a long moment, everything stood still. The silence pressed in on me like a suffocating blanket, broken only by the muffled sound of my panicked breathing. My mind raced, my heart pounding in my chest, unable to find any way out. And that's when it hit me, this wasn't just a road trip gone wrong. I wasn't alone. I hadn't been alone since I'd first seen that figure in the diner. And now it was time for it to finish what it had started. I felt the car's engine hum beneath me, but I couldn't hear it through the pounding in my ears. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely keep them on the steering wheel. The creature, if I could even call it that, was still there, its face frozen in that unblinking stare, just inches from the window. It had said something, or at least tried to, but my mind had blocked out the words in favor of focusing on my survival. The terror running through me was enough to paralyze anyone. I knew that if I didn't act fast, whatever it was outside the car would claim me like it had claimed so many others before. My instincts screamed for me to run, but my body was frozen. I couldn't move, couldn't make a decision. The only thing I could do was keep my eyes fixed on that grotesque figure, willing myself to hold on to the shred of reality that hadn't yet been ripped away. I tried to breathe, to clear my mind and come up with a plan. My gaze never strayed from the thing at my window. It was staring at me now, its hollow eyes locked onto mine, almost as if it were waiting for me to make the first move. I knew that whatever choice I made, it would change everything. The air felt heavy, thick with dread. Then, suddenly, without warning, the thing jerked its head back, as if responding to something far off. The tapping stopped. For a brief, fleeting second, it was as if the creature had been called away. I didn't question it, I only took my chance. I slammed my foot on the gas, the car lurching forward with a violent jolt. I could hear the engine roar to life as I sped away, the tires screaming against the pavement. My heart raced as I looked into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature chasing after me, its grotesque form following relentlessly. But there was nothing. Nothing but the empty, dark road stretching on and on into the distance. I didn't dare slow down. My foot remained firmly pressed against the pedal as the miles flew by in a blur of darkness. I passed mile marker after mile marker, and with each one, the tension in my chest started to loosen. But even though the immediate threat seemed to have disappeared, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. The sense of unease clung to me like a second skin. The road was desolate, just as it had been before, but now it felt even emptier. As I drove, I noticed more signs of neglect. Old, rusted cars on the side of the road, their tires flat, windows shattered. Abandoned vehicles that no one had bothered to move or reclaim, as if this place had been forgotten by time itself. I couldn't help but wonder, had I just barely escaped whatever haunted this forsaken stretch of highway? Or had the thing outside my car decided to let me go, its interest lost for the time being? I had no answers, no way of knowing, but I couldn't allow myself to think about it for too long. The fear that still clung to me was a constant reminder that I was never truly safe. I continued driving hour after hour until the sun began to rise. The sky lightened with soft hues of purple and pink, and the first rays of daylight started to break through the darkness. I could finally breathe a little easier, feeling the weight of the night lift as the world around me came back to life. I had made it out, but as the sun rose, so did the unanswered questions. What had I just witnessed? Was I still being followed? Finally, as I approached the edge of the desolate stretch of road, I saw the first signs of civilization. A small town, its buildings outlined against the horizon. I pulled into a gas station, my hands still trembling as I shut off the engine. The attendant gave me a curious look, but I was too exhausted to offer an explanation. I paid for the gas quickly, and before he could say another word, I drove off again, my mind reeling with confusion and fear. The town was quiet. too quiet. It felt almost as if I had entered a place that time had forgotten. The roads were empty, the buildings run down. No one was outside. It was as if the entire town had been abandoned. I couldn't even shake the thought that I might be the last person left in a place that had once been alive. I needed answers, but no one in this town could give them to me. I stopped at a diner, hoping to find some sign of life, but when I entered, the place was eerily silent. The waitress at the counter didn't look up when I walked in. The coffee cups on the tables were untouched. I stood there for a moment, trying to get my bearings, before I noticed something strange: an old, weathered newspaper on the counter, its headline bold and stark. Disappearance in the area, multiple unsolved cases. I walked over to the counter, my pulse quickening. I glanced down at the article. It described a series of mysterious disappearances from the surrounding area over the past few years. The authorities had no leads, and there were no clear explanations. A chilling thought crept up my spine. Had I stumbled onto the location of all those vanished people? The waitress seemed to sense my growing unease. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes vacant, almost hollow, much like the figure I had encountered. Her lips twisted into a thin, unnatural smile. "You should leave," she said, her voice cold and distant. "You don't belong here." My heart stopped. I didn't need any more convincing. I turned and walked out of the diner as quickly as I could, my body flooded with a mixture of fear and disbelief. I drove away from the town, never once looking back. As I made my way back to civilization, the landscape became more familiar, the world outside returning to some sense of normalcy. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, lingering just outside my perception. What had I encountered? Was it a creature, a spirit, or something far worse? Even now, I can't say for sure. I've tried to forget, to push the memories of that night out of my mind. But I can't. Every now and then, I feel a presence watching me from the shadows, a cold chill creeping up my spine. It's as though it's waiting, patiently, to strike again. I don't know if I truly escaped. I don't know if anyone ever really does. The days that followed were a blur, a haze of confusion and doubt. I tried to tell myself that everything I had experienced that night was just a bad dream, a product of fear and exhaustion. After all, I had been driving alone for hours on a road that felt endless, surrounded by nothing but emptiness. The mind has a way of distorting reality when you're pushed to your limits. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the images of that grotesque figure, or the way it had stared at me, its hollow eyes locked on mine like it was searching for something deep inside me. I found myself questioning every detail. Had I seen what I thought I saw? Or had I simply misinterpreted the shadows and the night's strange noises? But then there were the signs, the deserted cars on the side of the road, the broken windows of houses I passed by, the unnerving silence that had filled the air the moment I pulled into that small town. The thought gnawed at me. What had happened to all those people who had vanished? The waitress's words kept echoing in my head. "You don't belong here." Had she known something I didn't? Was I somehow connected to whatever force was lurking in that desolate stretch of land? My mind raced with the possibilities, but no matter how many theories I came up with, nothing seemed to make sense. Every explanation I could think of only led to more questions. It wasn't just the events of that night that haunted me, it was the feeling that something had changed within me. Since leaving that place, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched, that something was following me, patiently waiting for the right moment. I couldn't go anywhere without looking over my shoulder, wondering if I was being followed by an unseen presence. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I'd wake up with the sense that something was standing just outside my window, waiting for me to look. I tried to push it aside, telling myself I was being paranoid. But it was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, a cold shadow I couldn't escape. Over time, the feeling began to fade, or at least I convinced myself it had. I returned to my normal routine, trying to get back to the life I had known before. But even as I resumed my daily activities, I couldn't help but feel that a part of me had been left behind on that lonely highway, forever connected to whatever had happened there. The world felt just a little more sinister now, as if the line between reality and the unknown had been permanently blurred. One day, months later, I found myself standing at the edge of the same highway, staring out into the wilderness that stretched out before me. I wasn't sure what had brought me back here, but it was as if something deep inside me was pulling me to this place, as if I needed to know the truth about what had happened. I stood there for a long time, the wind howling around me, but there was no sign of the thing I had encountered that night. The road was empty, the silence overwhelming, and yet I could still feel it, that same unease that had gripped me all those months ago. It was still there, just beyond the edge of perception, waiting for me to come closer, waiting for me to uncover what had been hidden. I knew, deep down, that I couldn't outrun it forever. No matter where I went, that place would always be with me. It had changed me in ways I didn't fully understand. The terror I had felt that night had woven itself into the fabric of my being, leaving me with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. Even now, as I stood there, I wondered if I had made a mistake in coming back. Had I stirred something up that should have been left alone? As I turned to leave, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder one last time. The wind had stopped, and the silence felt heavier now, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I never returned to that place again. I couldn't. The memories were enough to remind me that some roads are better left untraveled, some questions are better left unanswered. I moved on with my life, but I couldn't forget. There are things in this world that we can't explain, things that exist just beyond our understanding. We were a group of friends, just a few regular guys looking for a little thrill after a long week. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing that should have led us to what we'd soon face. We'd been friends for years, our connection forged through time and shared experiences. Every weekend, we'd find something new to occupy our time: games, movies, hiking, or even just sitting around in someone's garage talking about life. It was our routine, and there was comfort in the simplicity of it. I'm Luke, the one who always liked to push things a little further, to find something more exciting, something different. That's probably why I was the one to bring up the idea of the old factory on the outskirts of town. I'd seen it before, a hulking structure surrounded by rusted fences, overgrown weeds, and the kind of silence that screamed to be explored. The factory had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, and rumors about it had circled the town for years. Some said it had been closed down because of some tragic accident. Others claimed it was haunted, cursed even. But none of that stopped me. And, maybe naively, none of that stopped my friends either. We were eager for an adventure, the kind of adventure that would make for a great story, something to share with everyone once we were safely home, laughing over cold drinks. Nothing too serious. Just a thrill-seeker's way of breaking up the monotony. There were 5 of us. Me, Luke, always ready to stir the pot a bit, the practical one, who could never quite shake the feeling that we were doing something stupid, yet still went along with it. Greg, the one with the big ideas, but the least amount of common sense when it came to following through. Mike, the quiet guy, who didn't always speak up, but always seemed to know more than he let on, and Sam, who was easily the most cautious of us, but somehow always ended up being dragged into whatever we were doing. That evening, we piled into my car, the windows down, the air warm and carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and a faint trace of diesel fumes from the nearby freeway. The kind of evening where everything seemed like it was in its right place, like nothing could go wrong. It felt like the perfect time for a little exploration. Little did we know, that decision would be the beginning of something we couldn't easily undo. We drove out to the factory, the pavement stretching ahead of us, the buildings growing fewer and farther between as we left the familiar part of town behind. The closer we got, the more oppressive the atmosphere seemed to become, but none of us said a word. In that strange way, it felt right to be doing something outside the ordinary, and none of us were ready to turn back just yet. As we pulled up to the dilapidated factory, the sounds of the outside world faded away, like the place existed in its own bubble, cut off from everything else. The once imposing structure loomed before us, its windows blacked out, some of the panes cracked, and the rusted steel gates hanging loosely. There were no lights in the building, no signs of life, just shadows stretching across the cracked concrete, casting eerie silhouettes under the dying light of the day. We parked a little way from the entrance, staring at the factory from the comfort of the car for a moment. It was quieter here than I had anticipated. In fact, there was an unsettling stillness in the air. I could tell Ben was starting to feel the weight of it too, his usual chatter gone silent. But none of us spoke up. We just got out of the car, one by one, trying to appear braver than we felt, though deep down, we were all a little uneasy. The factory itself wasn't much to look at from the outside. It had once been a thriving place, from what I had gathered from the stories, the kind of factory that employed dozens of people, supplying goods and services to the city for decades. But now it stood as a forgotten relic, abandoned and decaying, with its large metal doors barely hanging on their hinges. Greg was the first to approach, of course. He was always the one eager to lead the charge, and, despite the feeling in the pit of my stomach, I followed him. Mike and Sam trailed behind, their footsteps hesitant, and Ben, as usual, was the last to join in, his face a mixture of curiosity and caution. The gate creaked as we pushed it open, the sound echoing through the otherwise silent surroundings. The air smelled musty, thick with the scent of mildew and stale air. Inside the factory was a vast, cavernous space, filled with broken equipment and rusted metal beams, the remnants of what had once been a place of productivity and industry. We stepped inside, and I felt an odd shiver run down my spine. It was like stepping into a tomb, a space frozen in time. There was no telling how long it had been since anyone had last walked through those halls. Dust settled on every surface, untouched by human hands for years. The floor was cracked and uneven, and the shadows seemed to move as the last light of day faded completely. And so, we began our exploration, poking through the remnants of the factory, half-heartedly laughing at how creepy it all felt. We wandered aimlessly through the halls, taking turns opening old doors, peering into forgotten offices, and trying to make the best of the situation. But something wasn't right. There was a strange sensation that lingered, like we weren't alone. Like we were being watched, though we could see no one. It wasn't until later that night that we would realize how far wrong we were. At first, it was just a strange feeling in the air, a sort of heaviness that settled over us as we ventured deeper into the building. But it was easy to shrug it off, dismissing it as a byproduct of the factory's decaying state. That was until we heard it. A soft scraping sound, like metal dragging across the floor. It came from somewhere deep within the factory, echoing in the silence. I remember feeling my heart race, my body frozen for a moment. I glanced at Ben, whose face had gone pale. He looked at me, eyes wide, but we didn't speak. We didn't need to. Sam was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you hear that?" We all nodded, too scared to say anything. That was when I realized something was seriously wrong. And just as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. Dead silence. But the unease remained, and it wasn't going away. We stood frozen in place, the faint echoes of that dragging sound still lingering in our ears. The silence that followed was thick, almost oppressive, but none of us moved. We stood there, caught between fear and disbelief, unsure of what to do next. Sam was the first to speak after the noise died down. His voice trembled slightly, but he tried to mask it with a nervous laugh. Maybe it was just an animal or something, he suggested, though the uncertainty in his voice was hard to ignore. It was the kind of thing you'd say to reassure yourself, even if you didn't believe it for a second. We all knew that this place had been abandoned for years. No animals had taken residence here, not any living ones, at least. The idea was just a way to dismiss the creeping sense of dread that had already begun to settle over us. Ben, who was usually the practical one, glanced at the others. His eyes were narrowed, his lips tight. He was trying to rationalize it, but the tension in his posture betrayed him. "That didn't sound like an animal," he said, his voice low. "We should go back. This isn't right." But we didn't. Not yet. Greg, ever the leader of the group, was the first to brush it off. He waved his hand dismissively, trying to put on a brave front. "Come on, guys. It's just an old building. Probably some rats or something. We came this far. Might as well keep going." We all exchanged uneasy glances, the unease gnawing at our insides, but we followed him anyway. We had already come this far. The lure of the unknown and the promise of a story to tell kept us moving forward, despite the odd feeling that had settled in the air. The factory was vast, with long hallways that stretched into the shadows. The more we walked, the more it felt like the walls were closing in on us. There were piles of forgotten debris, old machinery long since rendered useless, and broken windows that allowed the faintest breeze to stir the dust. It should have been just another forgotten place, but it wasn't. There was something about it, something off. We pushed forward, trying to shake the feeling that was growing stronger with every step we took. The factory had an old, musty smell, a combination of damp wood, rusted metal, and something chemical that clung to the air like a heavy fog. My eyes scanned the darkness ahead, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. But there was no time to think about it. We had to keep moving. We had to push past the fear and see this through. Then came the sound again. This time, it wasn't a scrape. It was more like a faint thud, followed by a subtle creak, like something or someone was walking behind us. The noise was muffled, distant, but unmistakable. We all froze again, our eyes darting around the darkened hall, trying to pinpoint the source. But there was nothing. No movement. No shadows that didn't belong. "Did anyone else hear that?" Mike asked, his voice barely a whisper, his hand already gripping the back of Sam's jacket like a lifeline. "I heard it," Sam answered, his voice shaky, his eyes wide. "It's like something's following us." Ben, the one who had seemed the most grounded up until now, swallowed hard. He looked over his shoulder, his face pale in the dim light, and then turned back to us, his voice tight with anxiety. "Okay, this is getting weird. Maybe we should leave. Now." Greg, as always, was the last to admit there was anything wrong. He rolled his eyes and gave a nervous laugh. "Come on, guys. It's just an old building settling or..." But before he could finish, we heard a door slam shut somewhere in the distance, followed by a series of loud, rapid footsteps echoing through the factory. My heart skipped a beat, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. There was no mistaking it this time. Something was moving inside this place. Something that wasn't us. "Okay, we need to go now," Ben said, his voice almost panicked. "I'm not staying in here another second." But just as we started to turn to head back toward the entrance, the temperature dropped. It wasn't gradual, but rather immediate, like stepping into a freezer. The chill hit us all at once, and we could see our breath in the air, swirling in the dim light. Our skin prickled as if the air itself had turned hostile. I don't know what made me do it, but I turned around. I couldn't explain it, but something tugged at me to look into the shadows of the corridor. I squinted, trying to make out shapes in the dark, my heart pounding in my chest. And that's when I saw it. At the far end of the hall, in the darkness, there was a figure. It wasn't clear at first, just a vague shape standing motionless, barely visible, as if it were waiting for us. My breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away. My heart was racing in my chest, and I could feel the cold sweat beginning to trickle down my back. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Ben and Sam both turned toward me, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. They saw nothing. Greg, ever the skeptic, took a step forward, peering into the darkened hall. "What the hell are you talking about?" Greg muttered, his voice shaky. "There's nothing there, but I saw it. I knew I saw it." "Let's just go," Mike said, his voice trembling. "Please, I don't want to be here anymore." We all turned toward the exit, but the figure was still there, just out of reach of the light, watching us. My legs felt like they were made of stone, but somehow we managed to move forward. The factory felt more oppressive now, as if the walls themselves were closing in on us, urging us to leave. We didn't speak after that. We didn't need to. We just moved faster, pushing through the factory's labyrinthine hallways, our footsteps echoing louder and louder, the fear building in our chests. The air had grown heavier, thicker, like the factory itself was alive and angry at our intrusion. Finally, we reached the entrance, and the familiar sight of the outside world never looked so welcoming. We burst out into the night, the chill air feeling like a relief compared to the stifling atmosphere of the factory. We didn't stop running until we were back in the car, doors locked, windows rolled up, and the engine roaring to life. We didn't say much on the way home, each of us lost in our own thoughts, the images of what we'd seen or hadn't seen lingering in our minds. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us out of that place, that whatever had been watching us wasn't finished yet. None of us really spoke about what happened. The silence between us was heavier than any conversation could be. But we all knew that unspoken understanding hung in the air, threading through our interactions like an invisible tether. Something was wrong with that factory. Something was wrong with what we had seen or thought we had seen. It wasn't until a week later that we found ourselves back there. I can't speak for the others, but for me, the feeling of unfinished business gnawed at my insides. I hadn't felt right since that night. It was as though the figure we saw had somehow lodged itself in my mind, seeping into my thoughts at the most inconvenient times. I couldn't ignore the nagging question that had been looping in my brain. What was that thing in the factory? What had we heard that night? And why had we felt like something was following us? So, when Greg called me a week later and suggested we go back, it wasn't entirely surprising. Maybe we were all looking for answers in some way, a need to understand what we couldn't quite grasp the first time around. We agreed to meet early in the morning, before the sun had fully risen. The drive out to the factory was quieter than the last time. The air was thick, humid, and the sky hung heavy with clouds that seemed to promise rain, but didn't deliver. It was the perfect kind of weather for a place like that, desolate, cold, and foreboding. The factory loomed in the distance, just as I remembered it, silent, dark, and broken. Its windows stared blankly out at us, each one a vacant eye, watching as we approached. The closer we got, the more the uneasy feeling from the week before resurfaced. "I think we're making a mistake," Ben muttered from the back seat, his voice low, almost a whisper. He didn't look at any of us. His eyes were fixed on the factory in the distance, as if he could already sense something waiting inside. But we didn't stop. Greg was driving, and as usual, he took the lead. He was the one who kept pushing us forward, encouraging us to investigate. "We need to know what's going on," he said, his voice firm, but with a hint of uncertainty. We parked the car just outside the factory's gates, which were rusted and nearly falling off their hinges. It was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife absent in the early morning stillness. Even the air felt different this time, thick and stagnant, like something was pressing down on it. Once again, the weight of the building's looming presence settled over us as we walked toward the entrance. It seemed like we had forgotten how big and intimidating the place was, how easy it was to feel like a tiny speck in the shadow of something this massive. The factory was like a tomb, and we were the unwelcome intruders. As we stepped inside, the smell hit us immediately. It was worse than I remembered, a mixture of mildew, decaying wood, and something metallic that made my stomach turn. The place was damp, colder than the outside air, and there was an odd metallic taste in the air, as though the building itself was exhaling the stale remnants of something it had been hiding for years. The lights flickered briefly as we moved deeper into the factory, casting long, disorienting shadows along the walls. I shivered. "Let's split up this time," Greg suggested, his tone more serious than usual. "We'll cover more ground that way. Just stick together, don't go too far." We all hesitated for a moment, exchanging uneasy looks, but the need to uncover the truth, or at least silence the fear gnawing at us, outweighed our hesitation. We agreed to go our separate ways, but none of us strayed too far from the others. I wandered through the broken hallways, feeling the crunch of glass beneath my boots as I passed shattered windows and rusted machinery. The air was thick with dust, and the only sound was the soft shuffle of our feet and the distant creak of metal. It was as if the place was holding its breath, waiting for something. That's when I heard it. A faint noise. Not loud, not like the door slamming the week before, but a soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't consistent, and at first, I thought it might have been my own heartbeat in my ears. But when I stopped to listen, it became clearer, closer. It was a tap, tap, tap. It was coming from behind one of the closed doors at the far end of the hallway. My body went cold. I motioned for the others to stop, and we gathered quietly around the door. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like something or someone was inside, trying to get out. I was the one who reached for the door handle. My fingers trembled, but I gripped it tightly and turned it. The door creaked loudly as it opened. The room inside was dark, too dark for my eyes to adjust at first. The moment I stepped into the room, I felt it a cold, biting chill that cut right through me. And then I heard it, a shuffle, a movement coming from the far corner. I could barely make out a figure standing in the dark, its shape a vague, shadowy outline. My heart hammered in my chest as I froze. "Who's there?" Greg called out from behind me, his voice sharp. But the figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a slow step forward, and then another, until it was just barely visible in the dim light. It was a person, someone standing motionless, their face hidden in the shadows, but they were not moving like a human. Their movements were stiff, jerky, almost unnatural. "Is this some kind of joke?" Ben asked nervously, his voice shaking, his hand gripping the flashlight. I stepped back instinctively, but then the figure lurched forward with unnatural speed, causing us to jump back. It didn't say anything it didn't need to. The way it moved was enough to make my skin crawl, and I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. I couldn't take my eyes off it. There was something about the way it stared at us, something wrong. It wasn't just a person. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. "Run," I whispered, the word barely escaping my lips before I turned to sprint toward the exit. My heart pounded in my ears, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know if the others were following, but I didn't look back. The feeling of something close behind me was overwhelming, and I couldn't get out fast enough. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for air. The factory loomed behind us, its empty windows dark and silent, as though it had never been alive at all. But we all knew what we had seen, or thought we had seen. And the tapping sound? It still echoed in my head, reverberating with the same rhythmic, unsettling noise. We couldn't explain it. We didn't know what had happened in that room. But whatever it was real, and we couldn't deny it any longer. The factory wasn't just abandoned. It was something else entirely. And we had just gotten a glimpse of what was hiding inside. We didn't say a word as we made our way back to the car. The silence was thick with the weight of what had just happened, what we had witnessed. None of us dared to speak, to voice the terror that had taken root inside us. The factory loomed in the rearview mirror, its dark windows like vacant eyes, watching us leave. I could still hear the tapping in my mind, as if it had followed us out, echoing in the corners of my thoughts. We piled into the car without exchanging a single glance. Greg's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white, his eyes fixed ahead, but his jaw was tense, grinding in silent disbelief. Ben, who had been the most vocal about leaving before, sat in the back seat with his arms crossed, staring out of the window. He looked almost numb, as if trying to shut out everything that had just occurred. I couldn't blame him. What the hell was that? I finally muttered, breaking the silence. My voice felt too loud in the car, too sharp in contrast to the stillness that had settled around us. I don't know, Greg said, his voice low and shaky. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly still shaken, his eyes flickering to the rearview mirror before quickly returning to the road. It wasn't human. I know that much. It was something else. The unease in his voice was palpable. The terror we all felt was so intense, it was almost suffocating. And yet, as we sat in that car, driving away from the factory, none of us could bring ourselves to fully process what we had just seen. It was like our brains were in denial, refusing to acknowledge the truth. It wasn't until we got back to Greg's place, parked in his driveway, that we could truly speak. The first words I said were more of a question than anything else. What the hell was that thing? Greg didn't respond immediately. He sat in the driver's seat, staring ahead, his hand still gripping the wheel. Ben, who had remained quiet for the entirety of the drive, suddenly spoke up. That wasn't a person, he said, his voice tense. I don't care what anyone says, that thing wasn't human. I've never seen anything like it in my life. It wasn't just the way it moved, it was wrong. You saw the way it looked at us, didn't you? It was like it knew us, like it was watching us, like it was waiting for something. His words cut through the thick air, and for a moment, none of us knew what to say. I could still feel the pressure of the thing's gaze on me, and my stomach churned at the thought of its eyes, dark, hollow, with something impossibly empty behind them. We need to go back, I heard myself say, before I even realized I was speaking. The words left my mouth with an urgency I hadn't expected. My heart was still racing, and the adrenaline hadn't fully worn off yet, but there was something else. Something in my gut that told me we hadn't seen the full picture, that whatever was in that factory wasn't done with us. It had been waiting for us, and now that we had seen it, it wasn't going to let us go so easily. Are you insane? Ben shot back, his eyes wide. No, we're done. We saw what we needed to see. That place is cursed, or haunted, or whatever. We don't need to go back. But there was something in his voice, a tremor, a hesitation that told me he wasn't as sure as he sounded. He had seen it too. We all had. And despite our fear, despite the overwhelming urge to run and never look back, part of us knew we couldn't just leave it there. We needed answers. It was like a magnet pulling us back, drawing us to the place we knew we shouldn't go. I'm going back, I said more firmly this time. I'm not going to just leave it like this. Greg, who had been silent up until that point, finally spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. I'm with you. If we're going back, we go together. Ben looked between us, his expression conflicted, but in the end, he nodded, albeit reluctantly. Fine, he muttered, but this is it, no more. After tonight, we leave it behind. And so, we found ourselves back at the factory. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the crumbling building. The air was colder than before, biting into our skin as we approached the entrance. The doors creaked as we pushed them open, and the familiar, oppressive stench of mildew and decay washed over us. As we stepped inside, the familiar unease settled into my chest again, tightening like a fist. The factory seemed even darker this time, the shadows longer, the air thicker. It felt as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. We moved cautiously through the hallways, the silence amplifying every creak and groan of the structure. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, the oppressive atmosphere pressing in from all sides. I kept expecting to hear the tapping sound again, but it never came. Still, something was there, something that made the air feel wrong. Then, without warning, we heard a loud metallic bang from deep within the factory, followed by a dragging noise. My heart skipped a beat, and we froze. It wasn't a person, it wasn't the factory settling. This was something different, something deliberate. The noise came again, closer this time, dragging across the concrete floor like nails on a chalkboard. It was unmistakable. Something or someone was moving through the factory. We turned to each other, panic rising in our chests. "Do you hear that?" Greg whispered, his voice strained. I nodded, but I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, and the fear had lodged itself in my chest, making it hard to breathe. And then, as if it had been waiting for us, the figure appeared again, only this time. It wasn't just standing in the shadows. It was moving toward us. Slowly at first, then faster, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a broken puppet being pulled on invisible strings. It was taller than before, its limbs too long, too stretched out, its face now clearly visible. But it wasn't a face. It was a mask, a dark, hollow void with jagged cracks running through it, as though it had been shattered and poorly repaired. The eyes, or what should have been eyes, were two deep, black sockets that seemed to absorb all the light around them, pulling everything into their emptiness. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, my body frozen in place. "Run!" Greg screamed, breaking the paralysis that had taken hold of us. But it was too late. The figure lunged, and everything went black. I woke up to the sound of my own gasping breath, my chest heaving as if I had just run a marathon. My body was slick with sweat, and my mind was a chaotic mess of disjointed thoughts and lingering fear. My eyes snapped open, only to be met with an overwhelming sense of disorientation. I was no longer inside the factory. I was in the back seat of Greg's car. The familiar smell of leather and the hum of the engine told me that I had somehow been moved. My hands gripped the seat beneath me, trying to steady my racing thoughts. But the image of that thing, the creature in the shadows, was burned into my memory, so vivid and real that it felt like it was still there with us. The others were in the car with me, but they were eerily silent. I turned to look at them, my heart pounding in my chest, half expecting to see them looking as frantic and lost as I felt. But instead, they were just still. They stared ahead, their faces pale, eyes wide, as though they had seen something beyond comprehension. Ben was in the passenger seat, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. He wasn't moving, wasn't even blinking, as if he was frozen in time. Greg was at the wheel, but he wasn't driving. The car was just rolling down the road, moving on its own. The streetlights outside flashed past, casting eerie shadows through the windows, making everything feel like a dream. I didn't understand how we got here. The last thing I remembered was the thing lunging toward us, its jagged mask coming closer, its unnatural movements filling me with dread. I could still hear its hollow footsteps, even now, echoing in my mind. "Greg," I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. "Greg," I said more forcefully, my voice breaking through the haze of confusion. He didn't look at me. He didn't even seem to acknowledge I was speaking to him. His grip on the wheel was tight, his knuckles white, but there was no emotion on his face. It was as if he was no longer there. "Ben?" I turned to him, but he didn't move either. What happened? What did we? We didn't. Ben's voice was distant, almost robotic. We didn't make it out. None of us did. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What are you talking about?" "We're fine. We're here. We didn't leave," Ben said, his voice hollow and broken. "We never left. We're still in there. In the factory." The words hung in the air, settling over us like a heavy blanket. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt the blood drain from my face. What was he saying? How could we be still in there? We had escaped. We had. I had seen the car, the road, the streetlights. We had gotten out. We had to have gotten out. But as Ben's words sank in, the unsettling truth began to worm its way into my mind. I looked out the window again, focusing on the dark road passing beneath us. The world outside felt wrong, warped. The streetlights seemed to bend in odd angles, casting shadows that shouldn't have been there. The air felt thick, as though it was pressing in on us, suffocating us. And then there was the way the road stretched endlessly in front of us, like it was going nowhere, like it had no end. "Greg," I whispered again, my voice shaking. "Stop the car." He didn't respond. His hands were still gripping the wheel, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring at the road ahead. "Greg," I shouted, panic rising in my chest. My pulse was racing, and I could feel the walls closing in around me. Ben turned to look at me, his expression one of utter hopelessness. "You can't make him stop," he muttered. "None of us can. We're stuck." "Stuck," I repeated, my voice barely audible. Ben nodded, his eyes blank. "This is it. We didn't leave. We're still in the factory. This is the factory now. Everything outside is just an illusion, a trick." I couldn't comprehend it. It didn't make sense. I could feel the air in my lungs, the beating of my heart, the wind against my face as the car moved forward. We had left. We had to have left. But then, the reality of it hit me, a cold wave washing over me. The factory was not just a place. It was more than a building. It was a trap. And now, we were part of it. There was no escaping. There was no running. I tried to open the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was like it had been welded shut, an impenetrable barrier between me and whatever lay outside. "No," I whispered, the word barely escaping my lips. I pulled harder, but it was useless. We were stuck in the car, stuck in the factory. The others were staring at me, their eyes vacant, as if they had already given up. There was no escape for any of us. The terror that had gripped me in the factory, the thing that had followed us, had found a way to stay with us. It wasn't over. It had never been over. I slumped back in my seat, my mind spiraling into a state of disbelief and despair. I couldn't process it. I couldn't understand how this was possible. Had we been dead all along? Was this some kind of twisted afterlife? Or had the factory become something else, something that twisted the fabric of reality itself? The car slowed, finally coming to a stop. For the first time since the moment we had left, Greg's hands loosened from the wheel. His eyes were still wide, still unseeing. He didn't speak. I stared out the window, the darkness of the night pressing in on all sides. But the factory wasn't far. I could see it looming in the distance, its tall, dark silhouette standing out against the night sky. The building was there, watching us. And in that moment, I realized something that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. We hadn't just encountered something from the factory. The factory had become part of us. It had reached inside, taken hold of us, and twisted us into something else. We weren't just trapped in the factory anymore. The factory was inside us, its darkness lingering in our minds. It was no longer a place, it was a part of our reality. I looked at Greg, at Ben, their empty eyes staring back at me, and I understood. There would be no escaping. Not from the factory. Not from the thing that had been waiting for us. We had been part of it all along. And now, there was no going back. The road stretched ahead, the lights flickering in the distance. The factory's shadow loomed over us. And I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The air inside the car was thick with a silence that felt like it could swallow us whole. Greg, Ben, and I sat there in a kind of resigned stillness, as though we were no longer participants in our own lives. The factory, its dark presence, had seeped into every inch of our beings. It wasn't just a place anymore. It wasn't even just a memory. It was part of us, a shadow we couldn't escape, a burden we couldn't shed. I don't know how much time passed as we sat there in that car, parked on that endless, eerily silent road. The world outside seemed to have frozen. The night stretched on forever, the streetlights flickering with a kind of rhythm that felt unnatural. The only sound that filled the air was the soft hum of the car's engine, but even that seemed distant, like it was coming from a place far removed from our own reality. At some point, I started to wonder if we had truly escaped the factory. The longer I sat there, the more I felt like the car, the road, the night had all become part of the factory itself. I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Were we still inside those walls? Had the factory bled into the world outside? Had we ever really left? I turned to look at Ben again. His eyes were wide, vacant, staring ahead as though he wasn't truly seeing anything. He hadn't moved since we'd started driving, hadn't spoken a word, not even when I called out to him. It was like the person I knew was no longer there. Just an empty shell, his body a vessel, carrying him through this twisted version of reality. Greg, too, hadn't said a word. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, his grip still tight on the steering wheel, as if the act of holding on to something physical could keep him tethered to some kind of reality. But I knew better now. Reality had become a fleeting thing. We were no longer in control of it. The car seemed to move on its own, almost as if it were being guided by some unseen force, like we were passengers on a ride we had no choice but to take. And as the road stretched out before us, endlessly, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were heading towards something. But what? I kept glancing back toward the factory. It was still there, looming in the distance like a monstrous shadow that refused to fade. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt its pull. It was drawing us in, slowly, inexorably. Was it waiting for us to return? Or had it already claimed us? There was no telling. Time was slipping away. I realized then that I hadn't felt time pass since we left the factory, or perhaps since it had swallowed us. I couldn't recall how long we had been on the road, how many hours or days had passed. The world outside felt frozen in some kind of endless loop, as though it had all been suspended in time, caught between the past and the present. Are we still? I started, but my voice caught in my throat. I didn't even know what I was asking anymore. Was I asking if we were still alive? If we were still in the factory? If we had ever really left? The question felt pointless, as if the answer didn't matter. There was no escaping it. Not now. Ben didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge that I had spoken. His silence felt heavier than it had before, more final. It was as if he had already given up, his mind lost to whatever it was that had consumed him. I reached out, my hand trembling, to touch Greg's arm. He flinched slightly, but he didn't pull away. His eyes remained fixed on the road, his face pale and empty. "Greg," I said, trying again. "We need to stop. We need to." His eyes flickered toward me for a brief moment, but it wasn't the look of recognition I was hoping for. Instead, there was a blankness, an absence that seemed to swallow everything I had just said. "Stop?" Greg's voice was barely a whisper. It wasn't his voice. It wasn't the Greg I knew. His words felt hollow, distant, like they were coming from someone else. "There is no stopping." His words hung in the air, heavy and final. And for the first time since all of this started, I truly understood what he meant. There was no stopping. There was no going back. We weren't on a road anymore. We weren't even in the world we once knew. We were trapped. Trapped between this twisted version of reality and whatever nightmare the factory had created for us. The factory wasn't just a place. It had become a part of us, like a parasite, feeding off our fear, our uncertainty. It had a hold on us that went deeper than our minds, deeper than our bodies. It had burrowed into us, and now it was all we knew. The car continued to move, silently, as if it had a mind of its own. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything, but I couldn't. There was no sense to be made. I glanced back at the factory one last time. Its dark outline loomed, unchanged, unwavering. It was waiting for us. And no matter how far we drove, no matter how much we tried to escape, it would always be there, just beyond the horizon, just out of reach. It had never truly let us go. And that was the truth I was left with, a truth that gnawed at my soul with an unbearable intensity. We weren't free. We never would be. The night stretched on, endless, like the factory itself. And we were caught in the middle, prisoners of something we couldn't escape, something that had claimed us long ago. There was no conclusion to this story, no happy ending, just the quiet hum of the car, the steady beat of my heart, and the shadow of the factory that would never fade. And in that moment, I understood. There was no end, only a beginning that would never come. It was the summer of 2022 when I decided to take a break from the chaos of my everyday life. My job, the endless deadlines, and the constant buzz of city life were starting to feel like too much. I needed solitude. I needed space. So I did what any rational person would do. I packed my gear and set out for a solo hike into the woods. This wasn't just any hike. It was the sort of adventure that had always intrigued me, even if I'd never really dared to venture this far off the beaten path. The woods I was headed into were miles away from the nearest road. They were thick with trees, the kind of forest you see in photos, but never think you'd actually experience yourself. But there was something about the quiet pool of the unknown that called to me. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe the idea of being one with nature. Whatever it was, I was ready. The plan was simple. I'd spend 2 nights camping in a remote area deep in the woods. I had my tent, sleeping bag, enough food to last the trip, and a GPS to keep me on track. I wasn't worried. I've been hiking before. I've done day trips, even a few overnight hikes. This was no different, or so I thought. I arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. There was no one else around, just the whisper of the wind through the trees and the distant sound of birds calling out as they settled for the evening. The air smelled fresh, earthy, like pine and damp moss. It was the kind of air you could breathe in deeply, letting it fill your lungs and clear your mind. I couldn't help but smile. This was exactly what I needed. I should have taken more time to observe the surroundings, but I was eager to get moving. The path was well trodden at first, leading me through the edge of the woods, where sunlight still filtered through the gaps in the leaves. But soon enough, the trail narrowed and the trees thickened. The quiet began to settle in, and the weight of silence was heavier than I expected. It wasn't eerie, not yet, but it was different from what I was used to. The sounds of wildlife were present, but distant. It felt as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting. As I made my way deeper, the forest became darker. The trees towered over me, their branches twisting and curling like fingers reaching for the sky. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every now and then, as if expecting someone or something to be there. But there was nothing, just the forest. I found a clearing as night began to fall, the sky above darkening to a deep navy blue, with only a few stars piercing through the clouds. It was perfect. The ground was soft. The trees surrounding me stood like silent sentinels. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and settled in for the night. There was no rush, no deadlines, just me and the woods. I was sitting by the fire when I noticed something I hadn't picked up on at first. The forest was too still. The usual sounds that come with a night in nature, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, the calls of night birds were absent. There was a silence in the air that felt unnatural, like the forest had paused its life just for me. The silence didn't bother me at first. I thought it was just the result of being so deep in the woods. But as the hours passed, as I sat alone by the fire, that silence began to feel suffocating. I tried to shake off the feeling. I was just being paranoid, I thought. There was nothing to worry about. But when I crawled into my tent that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't as peaceful as I wanted it to be. I tried to sleep, but the quiet weighed heavily on my mind. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful, but oppressive. My flashlight flickered twice, and I wondered if I was just imagining things. But when I closed my eyes, I could feel the presence of something out there, watching. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I told myself it was just the dark, the isolation, playing tricks on me. But I couldn't stop the feeling. The night passed without incident, but I didn't sleep well. I was exhausted when I finally woke up, but I pushed the unsettling thoughts aside. I had come here to disconnect, to clear my mind, and that's what I intended to do. But deep down, I knew something wasn't quite right. The morning after my restless night, I woke up to the sound of birds calling in the distance, breaking the silence of the forest. The sun was peeking over the horizon, casting a soft golden light across the clearing where I had set up camp. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes as I tried to shake off the grogginess. The cold air nipped at my skin, but the promise of a new day filled me with some comfort. I told myself that I'd been imagining things spending the night alone in such a remote place was bound to play tricks on anyone's mind. I unzipped the flap of my tent and stepped outside, my boots crunching against the damp earth. The morning mist hung low to the ground, swirling as the sunlight broke through. Everything was still, the kind of stillness that only exists deep in the woods, far from the sounds of civilization. I breathed in deeply, letting the fresh air fill my lungs. The feeling of peace was enough to calm my nerves, at least for the moment. I made myself a cup of coffee, the warmth from the steaming mug helping to chase away the cold morning chill. I took my time, not in any rush, letting the forest surround me. There were no signs of wildlife yet, no rustling in the underbrush or birds darting from tree to tree. It was quiet, almost too quiet. I pushed the thought away. It had been like this the night before, and now that it was morning, I expected things to feel a little more normal again. After finishing my coffee, I packed up my things and began to pack away the tent. I could hear my own movements, each zip of the bag, each rustle of fabric, loud against the silence. I was halfway through breaking down my camp when something strange happened. A soft, whistling sound drifted through the trees. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound didn't seem quite right. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I stood frozen for a moment, the hairs on my neck rising as I tried to locate the source of the sound. It was coming from deeper in the woods, far beyond the edge of the clearing. It wasn't the chirping of a bird or the rustling of leaves. This was something else. I listened closely, trying to discern whether it was an animal or maybe even another hiker. But no, there was something unsettling about it. The whistling was soft, almost playful, but there was an odd, eerie quality to it, like it didn't belong. It reminded me of the way a person might whistle to themselves in the distance, but I was alone. I hadn't seen anyone else since I arrived. I shook my head and convinced myself that it was just the wind, or perhaps a bird. Nature could play tricks on the ears, especially in a forest this dense. But still, the sound persisted, faint but unmistakable. I looked around, scanning the forest line. Nothing. I had been hiking for hours yesterday, and the trail was completely clear. There shouldn't have been anyone else around. I pushed the feeling down, continuing to pack up my camp. I told myself that I was being paranoid. But as I slid the final item into my backpack, the sound stopped abruptly. Just like that, the forest fell back into its heavy silence. That was when I felt it, the shift. The air seemed thicker somehow, more oppressive. The feeling of being watched, that nagging sensation from the night before, crept back into my thoughts. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. I had a long hike ahead of me, and I couldn't afford to waste any more time. So I shouldered my pack, adjusted my straps, and set off along the trail. The trail was narrow, winding through thick trees, the ground soft underfoot from the morning dew. As I walked, I tried to push the strange whistling out of my mind. It was probably an animal, or just the wind playing tricks. It could have been a bird. It could have been anything. I didn't need to get worked up over it. The further I walked, the more the sense of unease seemed to build. The woods around me felt suffocating, the trees so thick that the sunlight barely reached the ground. The trail twisted and turned, following a path I had only lightly memorized from the map. It wasn't long before I started to feel disoriented. There were no markers on the trail, no signs of any other hikers. Nothing but the trees and the silence. Then came another strange occurrence, this one even more unsettling than the last. I reached a small creek, its water trickling quietly over the rocks. I paused for a moment, listening to the soft gurgle of the water as I bent down to refill my water bottle. As I straightened up, I heard a snap, the unmistakable sound of a twig breaking underfoot. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, my gaze shooting to the edge of the creek where the trees thickened. No one was there. The woods were empty, just as they had been when I arrived. I felt my pulse quicken, my instincts telling me that something was wrong. Maybe it was just another animal, or maybe the forest was playing tricks on me again. But this time, the snap of the twig hadn't been random, it had been deliberate. Too deliberate. I stood motionless for several long seconds, my breath shallow, waiting for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. No rustling of leaves, no footsteps, no whisper of wind. Just the soft murmur of the creek and the stillness of the forest. I should have kept moving. I should have ignored the feeling gnawing at me. But I couldn't. Something wasn't right. I decided to investigate, not knowing why, but feeling compelled to do so. I took a few hesitant steps toward the tree line, where the snap had come from, but as I did, I heard it again. Another twig breaking. This time closer. I turned quickly, scanning the woods around me, but I saw nothing. No movement, no shadow between the trees. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, my eyes darting from side to side. The air had grown thick again, heavy with tension. The peaceful solitude I had craved was now suffocating, the stillness unnerving. I didn't wait any longer. My mind screamed at me to leave, to get out of there before whatever or whoever was watching me made itself known. I turned and retraced my steps back to the trail, my pack bouncing against my shoulders with each hurried step. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I walked faster now, my pace quickening as the uneasy feeling clung to me like a shadow. I knew I was alone, but the sensation of being followed, of something lurking just beyond the trees, refused to leave. I reached the next bend in the trail. The unease that had settled deep in my gut had taken hold, tightening like a vice. The forest around me felt alive, yet something about it was wrong. The usual sounds of the woods, the chirping birds, the rustle of leaves in the wind had all but disappeared. Now, the world seemed muffled, almost as though I were walking underwater, with only the soft crunch of my boots against the trail breaking the silence. I quickened my pace, eager to get out of the strange, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to surround me. My eyes flicked to the shadows between the trees, my mind playing tricks on me as I imagined movement, shapes lurking in the periphery. I was starting to regret this entire trip, the peaceful retreat I had envisioned now feeling like a mistake. As I rounded a sharp curve in the trail, I stumbled upon a strange sight, a large old tree, its bark dark and weathered, with what appeared to be strange markings carved into the trunk. At first, I assumed it was just the handiwork of a previous hiker, maybe some kind of personal mark or symbol carved into the bark for reasons I couldn't comprehend. But as I stepped closer, I realized something unsettling. The markings weren't random. They formed a pattern, a circle of lines and shapes that seemed too deliberate, too precise. A shiver ran down my spine as I reached out to touch the marks. The moment my fingers brushed against the bark, a cold wave of unease washed over me. The sensation wasn't just physical, it was almost as if the tree itself was radiating something unsettling. The air around me seemed to cool, and the stillness deepened, pressing in on me like a weight. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. Just a tree, I muttered to myself, trying to dismiss the creeping dread that had begun to gnaw at me. But something in the back of my mind told me that the markings weren't simply a coincidence. They were part of something bigger, something I couldn't yet understand. I hesitated for a moment longer before moving on, but as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something staring at me from the shadows of the forest. But the woods remained still, too still. The trail continued to wind through the trees, the canopy above growing denser, blocking out more and more of the sunlight. The air felt thick, heavier with every step I took. I could almost hear my heart pounding in my ears, the sound of it blending with the eerie silence that had settled over the forest. It was only a few minutes later when I heard it again. A soft thud. It was faint but unmistakable. A dull, almost rhythmic sound, like something heavy dropping onto the forest floor. My eyes darted to the trees, scanning for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the swaying branches above me and the endless rows of trees stretching out into the distance. Another thud, louder this time. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. My heart began to race. I knew that sound. I had heard it earlier when I was near the creek, the snap of a twig, the sound of something stepping, something deliberately making noise just out of view. I wasn't alone, but who or what was out there? I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. I wanted to turn and run, to escape whatever it was that was following me, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. There was something holding me there, a magnetic pull drawing me deeper into the woods. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was just the knowledge that I was already too far in to turn back easily. Slowly, cautiously, I moved toward the source of the noise, each step a battle against the fear clawing at my chest. The thudding continued, rhythmic and steady, as if whatever was making it was walking alongside me, just out of view. I was nearing the edge of a clearing, the trees opening up to reveal a small, overgrown meadow. The thudding grew louder as I approached, the sound now unmistakable. It was coming from the clearing. I stopped at the edge of the trees, peering through the underbrush. The clearing was empty at first glance, the long grass swaying gently in the breeze. But then, as I scanned the area more closely, I saw it a small shape, hunched over, moving through the tall grass. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too controlled. My pulse quickened as I watched the figure, its movements jerky and unnatural, like something struggling to move properly. I couldn't make out its features, but there was something wrong about it. It wasn't human, at least, not in the way I understood humanity. I didn't dare move closer, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I wanted to scream, to yell out, but my voice caught in my throat. I felt paralyzed, unable to act, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, all of them screaming that I needed to get away. And then, as if sensing my presence, the figure stopped. Its head snapped up, and for the briefest moment, I thought it was looking directly at me. A chill ran down my spine as I staggered back, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was frozen, caught in a stare that seemed to pierce through the trees, through the air itself. But before I could react, the figure turned, moving swiftly into the thick woods beyond the clearing. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, leaving nothing but the rustling of leaves behind it. I didn't know how long I stood there, my body trembling with fear. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The image of the figure, its unnatural movements, its haunting presence was burned into my mind. When I finally gathered the strength to take a step backward, my legs felt like jelly. I stumbled through the trees, my breath coming in shallow gasps, the forest pressing in on me from every side. I wanted to run, but I had no idea where to go. The trail had disappeared behind me, and the woods seemed to stretch on endlessly in every direction. I needed to get out of there. I needed to find safety. But deep down, I knew that whatever had been watching me was still out there, hidden just beyond the trees, waiting. And I wasn't sure if I would ever be able to escape it. The air had turned unnaturally cold by the time I gathered enough courage to move. Every step I took was heavy. my body reacting with the fight or flight response that had been triggered earlier. My mind screamed at me to leave, but something inside, a darker instinct, made me press forward. The forest around me felt different, more alive, as though the trees were watching, the ground itself aware of my every movement. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had seen earlier was only the beginning, that something much worse was waiting for me. The clearing where the figure had vanished now felt like a distant memory, but the dread lingered. The trail was gone, replaced by a thick, impenetrable undergrowth that seemed to have sprouted overnight. It was as if the forest was actively trying to keep me in, to prevent me from escaping. The trees loomed over me, their dark branches twisted in grotesque shapes that made me feel as though they were closing in on me. I hadn't noticed it at first, but as I stumbled forward, the silence had grown oppressive. The only sound I could hear now was the rapid thumping of my heart. Even the usual rustling of the wind through the leaves was gone. The air was still, as though the entire forest had held its breath, waiting for something to happen. I could feel it in my bones, this terrible anticipation. Something was coming. Something that wasn't human. I pressed on, my pace quickening, but it didn't matter. No matter how fast I moved, the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly in front of me, offering no way out. Panic began to claw at me. I could feel my chest tightening, my breath shallow and uneven. The walls of the forest were closing in, and I was trapped in the thickening fog that had started to creep up, enveloping me in a cold, damp embrace. The path ahead was unclear, distorted by the mist that seemed to hang in the air like a living thing, shifting with every step I took. It was disorienting, and the ground beneath my boots had become treacherous, uneven. I could feel my ankle twist on the uneven surface, and I fell hard to the ground, the jarring pain shooting up my leg. I forced myself to stand, clutching a nearby tree for support. I scanned the forest, my eyes wide, desperately searching for any sign of a way out. That's when I heard it again. The soft thud. It was faint at first, but it was unmistakable. Like something was walking through the underbrush, heavy and deliberate. My body froze, my blood turning to ice. I wasn't alone. The figure from earlier was out there, somewhere in the fog. The thudding grew louder, closer. I could feel the ground vibrating slightly beneath my feet, as if something massive was moving through the trees. My pulse raced. It wasn't just one thing. It was many things. The air grew thick with tension, my senses heightened as I tried to discern the source of the sound. I couldn't see anything through the fog, but I could feel it. The presence was undeniable, a dark, suffocating weight in the air. And then, without warning, the thudding stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. The fog thickened, and the shadows around me seemed to stretch, moving in ways that didn't make sense. I tried to move, but my legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place by the weight of fear pressing down on me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then it appeared. A shape emerged from the fog. At first, it was just a silhouette, dark and indistinct, but as it drew closer, I could make out the details. It was tall, far taller than any human, and its form was hunched and twisted, its movements jerky and unnatural. It didn't look like anything that belonged in this world, its limbs too long, too thin, and its skin stretched tight over its bones, pale and mottled. My breath hitched in my throat as the figure stepped closer, its head tilted to one side as if studying me. Its eyes were not eyes at all. They were hollow, dark voids that seemed to suck in the light around them, drawing me in with an unholy gravity. I could feel the pull, a strange, magnetic force that made me want to step forward, to get closer to it, even though every instinct screamed for me to run. But I couldn't move. My legs were paralyzed with fear, and all I could do was watch as the creature approached. Its feet made no sound as it moved, its presence almost ethereal, as if it were part of the very fog itself, drifting closer without a care in the world. The air around it seemed to warp, the mist swirling as though caught in its wake. The creature stopped just in front of me, its head still cocked to one side. It was studying me, waiting, and then it opened its mouth. It wasn't a mouth in the way I knew mouths to be. It was a gaping hole, a chasm of blackness that seemed to grow larger as it moved toward me. Inside, there were no teeth, no tongue, no familiar human features. Just an endless, yawning void. I couldn't breathe. The darkness of its mouth seemed to swallow the light, pulling everything into it. I felt my body begin to sway, my mind slipping. It was as if I were being drawn toward the thing, as though every part of me was slowly, inexorably being pulled into that awful blackness. I tried to scream, to shout, to do anything that would break me free from its grip, but nothing came. My mouth was dry, my voice a ragged whisper lost in the thick fog. My heart was hammering in my chest, but it felt so distant, as though it was happening to someone else. The creature's presence loomed over me, suffocating me, until I thought I would collapse from the sheer weight of it. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The fog swirled and dissipated, the oppressive weight lifting from the air. I blinked, disoriented, my heart still pounding in my chest. The forest was quiet again. The mist had disappeared, and the trees stood still in the early morning light. But I knew that the creature was still out there, somewhere, waiting, watching. I didn't wait to find out. My feet, suddenly free from the paralysis that had held them, carried me forward, faster and faster, until I was running. My mind was a blur, consumed with nothing but the need to escape, to get away from whatever had just happened. But as I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still behind me, that whatever it was hadn't left, hadn't gone away. It was just biding its time, waiting for the next time I would wander into its grasp. And I knew, deep down, that there wouldn't be a next time, because I wasn't going to make it out of these woods alive. I ran for what felt like hours, my breath ragged and my legs burning, but no matter how fast I pushed myself, the feeling of being pursued never faded. It was as though the forest itself was alive, shifting, bending, as if it were leading me somewhere I couldn't escape from, no matter how hard I tried. The sun had barely risen when I finally stumbled into a clearing. My body was trembling, soaked with sweat and dirt. My heart raced in my chest, and every sound around me made my nerves jump. The air still felt wrong, too still, too thick. It was as though the fog had never really gone, just receded into the trees, lurking in the shadows. I dropped to my knees, my mind in a haze, unable to comprehend what I had just witnessed. That thing, the creature, was it real? Or had I simply lost my grip on reality after days of hiking alone in this desolate, suffocating place? Part of me wanted to believe it was all just some nightmare, a figment of my imagination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, I knew the truth. I knew what I had seen, and I knew it wasn't something I could explain away. I glanced around the clearing, hoping to find some sign of civilization, something to reassure me that I was still grounded in the world I had left behind. But there was nothing. The woods stretched out endlessly in every direction. It was as if I had entered a space that didn't belong to the normal world, a place outside of time and reason. The air still felt heavy, oppressive. The ground beneath me was soft, uneven, and I couldn't shake the sensation that the earth itself was unsettled, waiting for something to happen. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady, my thoughts muddled. Every part of me screamed for a way out, for any escape from this nightmare. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow moving in the trees. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the light, a branch swaying in the wind. But then it moved again, and I knew that it wasn't the wind. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The figure was far off in the distance, just outside the clearing, but I could see enough to know that it was something unnatural. Tall, too tall. Its movements were jerky and uncoordinated, but there was a horrible sense of purpose in the way it moved, a deliberate intention that sent a fresh wave of dread through me. I didn't wait. I couldn't. My legs, still weak from my earlier sprint, carried me forward, stumbling through the underbrush, pushing past branches and thorns, not caring about the scratches or bruises that covered my arms. I just needed to get away. I needed to escape. The forest seemed to close in around me as I ran, the trees pressing together like they were trying to trap me. Every step I took felt heavier, as if the very ground was trying to hold me in place, to slow me down. I didn't dare look behind me, but I could feel it, whatever was out there, whatever was watching me. It was close. Too close. The pounding of my heart filled my ears as I ran, and the world around me blurred. My thoughts were jumbled, consumed with only one thing: survival. The need to get out, to find my way back to the real world, to escape the nightmare I had found myself in. The clearing was a distant memory now. I didn't know where I was, and I didn't care. As long as I kept moving, I could almost convince myself that I was getting away. But then, just as the sky began to lighten, I saw it. The path. The trail that I had been following for days had appeared before me, winding through the trees. The familiar markers, the landmarks I had passed when I first started this trek, were now clear again, visible in the early light. It was as if the forest had decided to release me, to give me a way out. I didn't hesitate. I followed the path with a renewed sense of urgency, pushing through the brush, my steps quick and frantic. The trail led me in a straight line, through the dense trees, past the now silent undergrowth. The forest seemed to open up around me as I walked, the oppressive atmosphere lifting, and I could almost taste the air of freedom. Hours passed. The trail, once so disorienting and endless, now felt like a lifeline, leading me back towards civilization. My legs still ached from the exertion, but I was moving faster now, driven by the desperate need to leave it all behind. The oppressive feeling that had hung over me seemed to dissipate the farther I walked, until, at long last, the trees began to thin, and I saw the faintest hint of light breaking through the canopy above. And then, finally, I stepped out of the woods. The moment I broke through the trees, the familiar sight of the road appeared before me. It was real. The asphalt, the trees at the edge of the woods, the distant hum of a car driving by, it was all real. I was free. I had made it out. The woods, the creature, the darkness, it was all behind me now. But even as I walked down the road, my mind couldn't shake the image of the thing in the fog. Its hollow eyes, its twisted limbs. I didn't know what it was or where it had come from, but I knew that it wasn't done with me. I could still feel it out there, waiting, watching, biding its time. I don't know if I'll ever be able to shake the memory of those woods, of the nightmare I experienced there. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still feel the weight of that presence, that suffocating sense of being watched. And there are nights, when the darkness is thick and the wind howls through the trees, that I wonder if it's still out there, just waiting for me to return. But for now, I'm safe. For now, I've escaped. And I'll never go back. Never. It's been a few months since I returned from those woods, yet the memories still linger, like shadows that stretch across my mind, refusing to be shaken off. I've tried to return to my normal life, to find comfort in the routine that once seemed so simple: morning coffee, work, sleep, repeat. But the truth is, I've never truly been the same. That forest, those creatures, that eerie sensation of being followed, they've left their mark on me, deeper than I care to admit. I've tried talking to people about what happened, tried to explain the fear that gripped me, the way the trees seemed to close in, the unnatural quiet, and that thing. But each time, the words falter on my tongue, and I end up retreating into silence. How do you explain something like that to people who haven't seen it for themselves? It's one of those experiences that feels impossible to share, as though there's no way to truly convey the raw terror, the suffocating panic that comes with knowing something is out there and it's aware of you. The worst part isn't the creature, not really. It's not knowing if it's still there, if it's still waiting, watching. There are nights when the wind howls through the trees outside my window that I swear I hear something shifting in the distance. I'll lie awake, my mind racing, half expecting that thing to come through the door, to drag me back into that suffocating place. I try not to think about it, try to convince myself that it's just the wind or my imagination. But deep down, I know what I felt. I know what I saw. I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to escape. That the forest, that strange, unnerving place, wanted me to stay. And for a while, I believed it. I believed that whatever I encountered in that foggy abyss was going to claim me, that it had already decided my fate. But somehow, I made it out. Maybe that was the forest's way of showing me mercy, or maybe it was something else entirely. Maybe I wasn't supposed to make it out at all. Maybe the fact that I did means something far worse is waiting down the road. Maybe the only reason I left is because it wanted me to keep me on edge, to make sure I never forget. That's the thing about fear. It doesn't disappear when you escape. It lingers. It seeps into your thoughts and your dreams, twisting reality until you're unsure of what's real and what's imagined. I've tried to find comfort in the mundane things again, but every little noise, every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside reminds me of what I experienced. The forest never truly lets go. I keep telling myself that I've escaped, that I've outrun whatever it was that chased me, whatever force it was that lingered so menacingly in the trees. But in the quiet moments, when the world around me is still, I can almost feel it again. I can almost hear it. The sound of something following me. The knowledge that it's still out there, waiting. There's a part of me, deep down, that wonders if it's truly over. If leaving that forest behind was just the beginning of something worse. After all, what is it that I really escaped? Was it just the physical forest that I left, or was it something more? Something beyond the realm of what I understand? Something that I'll never fully be able to explain, even if I wanted to.